Chapter 10:24. The entire Chelan Cliff was like a cultivation world. And this world of cultivation was completely different from all the worlds of heaven and earth, all the worlds of time and space. Because the cultivators here did not grow up in the same time and space. There were a large number of cultivators who had transcended time in the future. Every cultivator's growth was completely different from that of other cultivators. Even their cultivation backgrounds were vastly different. How could a cultivation world composed of so many cultivators be found in any other world? The time and space these cultivators lived in was completely different from the other times and spaces. They were similar to the thousands of time projections that Luo Fan had experienced when he was on the Transcendence Path. Every one of them seemed to be in order of time, but in fact, they were all independent of each other. The cultivators in the distant future did not have the same past as the cultivators in the distant future. Similarly, the cultivators who didn't live that far back in time didn't have the same future as the cultivators who lived that far back in time. In this way, their cultivation systems, cultivation paths, and cultivation philosophies were naturally not too closely related. And the result of such sex was very obvious. This caused the many cultivators on the Chelan Cliff to have a great conflict. Due to their different ideals, countless sparks of wisdom were ignited. The entire cultivation world of the Chelan Cliff prospered because of this. Every cultivator had made great progress compared to when they had first set foot on the Chelan Cliff. Among them, the ones who had made the most progress were the ones who had become intermediate sages to be or low-level sages to be. Many of them had even broken through to become advanced sages to be or intermediate sages to be. Seeing this change, the sect inheritance Taoist was overjoyed even though he was only managing the Chelan Cliff on behalf of Wu Daozi. He felt an unimaginable sense of achievement. Senior, if you know how well I have managed the Chelan Cliff, you will definitely be satisfied. This was what the sect inheritance Taoist thought about the changes on the Chelan Cliff. However, when will this senior find out? With that thought, Sect Chuan Taoist let out a sigh. He looked at the place with the best cultivation environment on the Chelan Cliff. There it was. A Last Days temple stood tall. Outside the Last Days palace, Wu Daozi sat cross-legged with a frown. His body shone with brilliance. All sorts of complex and profound divine abilities were being unleashed from his body. What secrets does Luo Fan, who appeared in the beginning, have? Why does Senior care about it so much that you don't even care about the matters on Chelan Cliff anymore? Chuanzong Taoist was completely confused, and his mind was in a mess. At this moment, a time vortex in front of him suddenly started glowing bright red. Taoist Chuan, who had experienced this countless times, was already very familiar with it. He instantly knew that there should be more cultivators coming out of the era vortexes. He hurriedly gathered his thoughts and focused his attention on the many era vortexes in the sea of clouds in front of him. The red light above the era vortex was very bright and dazzling. This made Taoist Chuan frown. Due to his experience over the past tens of thousands of years, Chuanzong knew that the brighter and more dazzling the red light before a cultivator broke through the era vortex, the more powerful the cultivator who rushed out would be. Judging from the brightness of the red light, the cultivator who rushed out of the era vortex would be more powerful than the cultivators who rushed out of the era vortex in the past tens of thousands of years. Could it be a peak sage to be? Chuanzong Taoist thought to himself, and his frown became even more pronounced. Although there were many cultivators who rushed out of the era vortex in the past tens of thousands of years, and although they were powerful, the strongest were only peak sage to be. With Chelan Cliff as his backing, he could easily subdue such an existence. However, this was his first time facing a peak sage to be, and he had no confidence that he could subdue it with the help of Chelan Cliff. It seems that I have to use all my strength, he thought to himself, and his mind gradually entered an indescribable state. His whole body and mind gradually merged deeply with Chelan Cliff below. This kind of merging was very mysterious, and it contained all kinds of unimaginable principles. This was a wonderful mental cultivation method that he had created through the process of using the power of Cliff to subdue many cultivators over the past tens of thousands of years. This mental cultivation method allowed him to exert the power of Cliff to the extreme, and it allowed him to use the power of Cliff in the best way to help himself. This mental cultivation method was very beneficial to him. It could be more than 10 times stronger than he was before using this mental cultivation method. This was a very considerable improvement. Analyzing the process of using the power of Cliff to create a mental cultivation method that could push this effect to the extreme might seem exaggerated, but in fact, it was very natural and easy for any sage to be. No matter what era it was, what method they cultivated, or what path they took, being able to reach this stage meant that they were all geniuses and brimming with talent. Even the patriarch Taoist, who was suppressed by the title of sage and even submitted to Wu Daozi in a servile manner, was no exception. He was also a genius cultivator. For such a cultivator, it was very easy for him to create any method or mental cultivation method he wanted. For example, there are no divine skills or secret manuals in the mortal world that could make the cultivation world go crazy over them. To him, abandoning his wife and setting off a storm of blood was just a technique that he could create in a flash of thought. Under such circumstances, it was simply natural that the patriarch Taoist created a mental cultivation method that could make the effect of using the power of Cliff better after using it for tens of thousands of years. Using this mental cultivation method, the patriarch Taoist sat down cross-legged and slowly closed his eyes. He used his perception to lock onto the vortex of time while gathering the power of Cliff. He waited. This time, he had only waited for a day, and the epic vortex had changed. This was the fastest speed he had ever seen among the thousands of cultivators in the past tens of thousands of years. Before that, that was the fastest cultivator. From a moment the light shone. It would take at least 3 days and 3 nights for the era vortex to appear. It was a little slow. It might even take several years. This speed alone made the patriarch Taoist's expression change slightly. He felt that it was necessary for him to be prepared. He stood up, opened his eyes, and stared at the bright vortex of time in front of him. Suddenly, the era vortex shuddered, and an endless brilliance rushed out from it. In an instant, it covered the heavens and the earth, obscuring all vision and perception. The patriarch priest was almost blinded, and he completely lost his perception of the era vortex in front of him. He even forgot which era vortex it was in a trance. The brilliance not only affected the patriarch Taoist, but it also covered the entire Cliff. All the cultivators on the Cliff instantly knew what was going on. The overwhelming brilliance covered everything. It happened almost every few hundred years, and each time such a change occurred, it was time for new people to come. However, although they knew what was going on, the lessons they had learned over the past tens of thousands of years had taught them that the sect inheritance Taoist was extremely vigilant at this time. If they were to approach that location at this time, what awaited them would be extremely severe punishments. Although they would not be killed directly, it would not be a problem for them to suffer some pain and regret for being alive. The patriarch Taoist stood there with a rather nervous expression. At this moment, the brilliance began to gradually dim, and the scene that had been covered by the brilliance gradually appeared. It was a man. He looked like a young man in a Taoist robe, and there were all kinds of strange auras surging around him. The man stood there with a very calm expression. He floated above a vortex, and his eyes were slightly dazed. The patriarch Taoist's expression changed greatly when he saw this person. How is this possible? How could it be you? How could you appear here? These were the only thoughts that flashed through his mind at this moment. He was very familiar with this person, or rather, he was very familiar with this person's appearance. Back then, it was this person who had forced him to enter the vortex of time. He had been forced to walk the long path of transcendence, a path that made him wonder if he could continue to walk it every once in a while. This person was none other than one of the peak sages-to-be who had been in control of that era. He was also the one who had offended him back then. Many thoughts flashed through his mind, But he did not hesitate at all. With a slight thought, he raised his hand and covered that person. In an instant, the power of the Chelan cliff and his own power directly erupted, instantly wrapping around the man. The man was wrapped up by this power and had no way to resist. He was directly grabbed, and without any ability to resist, he appeared on the Chelan cliff, right in front of the Patriarch Chuan. He did not want to go anywhere else. Facing this person, the Patriarch Taoist's expression kept changing. He raised his hand a few times, wanting to kill this person, but he could not make up his mind. He did not dare to disobey the task that Wu Daozi had given him, and he did not dare to actually kill this person. Although the many living beings on the Chelan cliff did not dare to approach this place, this matter was of great importance. Although they did not dare to approach, they were still very concerned, constantly casting their gazes over here, paying attention to everything that happened here. At this moment, seeing the Patriarch Taoist expression keep changing, he was a little surprised for a moment. Does Tao Brother Patriarch know this person? That's impossible. All the cultivators that come out of the whirlpool of time are from different eras and time periods. How could Tao Brother Patriarch know this person? A cultivator said to his fellow cultivator. Could it be that this person's cultivation method is somewhat different from Tao Brother Patriarch's? Did he displease Tao Brother Patriarch, so he wants to kill him? His companion next to him guessed. That's impossible. We cultivate all kinds of strange techniques, and some of them have auras similar to that person's. Why is it that we are all fine, but that person can't help but attack us? No matter how I look at it, it's more likely that Tao Brother Patriarch knows this person. The person who spoke earlier said. Then why do you think Tao Brother Patriarch knows this person? His companion asked. This. Although the person who spoke was also a great perfection quasi-sage, he could not explain this fact. He could only frown and be tongue-tied, not knowing what to say. As they discussed, the Patriarch Taoist did not dare to attack in the end. He could only sigh helplessly. He retracted his hand, and his expression returned to its original state. It was filled with vigilance and a sense of superiority as he looked down on the Taoist. Evidently, he wanted to use his current power to suppress that person. That person was clearly stronger than any cultivator that the Patriarch Taoist had seen. At least, the speed at which he regained consciousness. He was much faster than the others. In just a short period of time, he gradually regained consciousness, and the confusion in his eyes gradually disappeared. It was a kind of clarity. It appeared in his eyes. As his eyes regained consciousness, his body gradually emitted a powerful aura. This aura was so powerful that it was as if he controlled the lives and deaths of billions and trillions of cultivators. He was a supreme emperor that controlled billions and trillions of time and space. Although this aura was faintly discernible, it was extremely noble in nature. This caused the Patriarch Taoist expression to change slightly. Who are you, and where is this place? That person had already regained consciousness and asked without waiting for the Patriarch Taoist to speak. His words were very calm and gentle, but the aura contained in his words was unimaginably strong. Any living being who heard his words would naturally be struck by an indescribable feeling, as if they were listening to a god of creation speaking to them, or a voice that they couldn't resist speaking to them, and they couldn't help but want to obey his words. This might be just an aura for others, but for the Patriarch Taoist, it was a completely unforgettable nightmare. For a moment, he could not help but want to spit out everything he knew without hesitation. Fortunately, he still noticed the 3 words in the person's words. Who are you? It was these 3 words that awakened the Patriarch Taoist from the uncontrollable state of surrender, made him discover the suspicious points, and forced him to maintain his sense of self. He gritted his teeth and used the sharp pain on his tongue to free himself from the thought of surrender. He said, "This is the world before the beginning of the era. You have now traveled through a long period of time and returned to the world without the existence of the cycle of the era. So that's how it is. Indeed, the era vortex is a path that transcends the cycle of the era." The person murmured. At this moment, he was completely ignoring the Patriarch Taoist, as if there was no one else around him. It was just like how a high and mighty emperor treated his subjects. For an emperor, his subjects had to answer whatever he wanted to know. However, he had no obligation to his subjects at all. To him, subjects were just like ants, so he did not need to pay attention to them or treat them as humans. Looking at that person, the expression on the patriarch Taoist's face changed. There seemed to be a kind of anger in his eyes, as well as a kind of enlightenment and a kind of charm of surrender. You seem to know me, but I remember that I have never seen you before. Why? That person looked at the patriarch Taoist and asked calmly. You must be mistaken. How could I know you? The patriarch Taoist was shocked and said instinctively. After saying this, he was so regretful that he wanted to slap himself. Even a fool would not believe what he had said. Given his performance just now, even an ordinary person with a little bit of observational ability would be able to tell that he knew him. Moreover, this person was obviously in existence at the peak of the sage-to-be realm. When such an existence released his perception, the whole world could not hide any secrets from him, let alone the change of expression and mood of a cultivator whose cultivation was not as high as his. If he had thought of something perfunctory, such as saying that he knew about you from somewhere, or that a certain cultivator had mentioned you before, or that he had given me a portrait of you, or that he had given me your aura, and that was how I knew about you, then he would have been able to explain himself. However, he had denied it just now, which was simply revealing that he was hiding something. It was obvious that he was hiding something. Even if this person was not interested in him, he might still be interested. Moreover, this person had come to a completely strange place and was in a state of vigilance. As expected, as soon as the person heard the patriarch Taoist's words, his eyes flashed, and he turned his eyes toward the patriarch Taoist. In an instant, the powerful aura on his body surged thousands of times and pressed down on the patriarch Taoist in an overwhelming manner. At the same time, he said, "You're lying." Chapter 1025. As soon as the man finished speaking, he suddenly raised his hand and tried to grab the ancestral Taoist. At this moment, the ancestral Taoist felt his entire soul sink into a deathly stillness, as if death had seized his soul and was about to embrace him completely at any time. The terrifying situation instantly plunged the ancestral Taoist into an indescribable fear. Fear was the best factor to stimulate one's potential. The ancestral Taoist suddenly felt an indescribable strength in his soul. This strength did not allow him to break free from the oppression of the man in front of him, nor did it allow him to break free from the man's grasp. However, it allowed him to mobilize the boundless power of Cliff that he had previously gathered. At this moment, this power descended and suddenly pressed down on the pinnacle of the sage-to-be. The pinnacle of the sage-to-be frowned. He could naturally continue to grab the ancestral Taoist. After all, although this power was powerful, it was not much of a threat to the pinnacle of the sage-to-be due to the limitations of the realm of the controller. Even if he allowed the power to suppress him, he would at most feel a little uncomfortable. Even if he was injured, it would only be a light injury. It would not affect him at all when dealing with the ancestral Taoist. Unfortunately, the ancestral Taoist was merely an ant to him. He wanted to capture him only because he felt that the man had been disrespectful and had lied to him. In fact, he was not determined to destroy the ancestral Taoist. Under such circumstances, the appearance of this new power naturally made him pay more attention to it. He immediately shifted his attention from the ancestral Taoist to that power. His mind moved slightly. He turned his hand, which was originally aimed at the ancestral Taoist, and grabbed at the power that was pressing down on him from above. This power was the power of Cliff, so one could imagine how powerful it was. However, this person was also a pinnacle of the sage-to-be, so the power of his magic power was unimaginable. Under such circumstances, the moment his hand and the power collided, an unimaginable change was triggered. In an instant, there was an explosion of endless splendor from the point where the two collided. On the palm of the man, the originally formless power was directly materialized. Like countless ribbons of light, they were directly materialized into real objects, and he grabbed them in his hand. He could make the power materialize, but the power would not leave him unharmed. At this moment, his aura stagnated slightly. The aura that he had been recklessly exuding was now gone. In an instant, it became chaotic. As the aura dissipated, Daoist Chuan regained his freedom. With a loud roar, he raised his hands high into the sky. The entire Qilin cliff shook violently. Subsequently, the void changed, and time and space condensed into a strange creature in front of him. This creature was incomparably huge. It had a dragon's head, a horse's body, and scales all over its body. It stood on auspicious clouds, and shockingly, it was a giant Qilin. After the Qilin was formed, it roared towards the sky and charged towards the pinnacle quasi-sage with a destructive force. The pinnacle quasi-saint grabbed the power of Qilin Cliff and suddenly noticed a brand new power condensing in front of him in the form of a Qilin charging towards him. He raised his brows and laughed. Good timing. As he spoke, he suddenly pulled the ribbon-like power with his right hand. The power was suddenly pulled by him, and in an instant, it turned into a net that blocked in front of him and the body of Qilin Cliff. The Qilin was surrounded by formless flames that scorched the surrounding time and space, causing the time and space to distort and change into all sorts of strange forms. It was as though countless strange creatures were being carried by the Qilin and charged towards the pinnacle quasi-sage. After the pinnacle quasi-sage blocked the power net in front of the Qilin, a huge phantom of a sovereign appeared behind him. The sovereign's aura around this sovereign was many times stronger than that of the pinnacle quasi-sage himself. The place where he stood seemed to have become a world of its own, making the void within a radius of hundreds of thousands of kilometers seem to have become the sovereign's kingdom. Everything was under the sovereign's control. At this moment, the Qilin formed by the power of Qilin Cliff suddenly shook. Suddenly, as though the source of its power had been cut off, it became dispirited and distorted at a speed visible to the naked eye. From the looks of it, it was about to turn into nothingness and become a bubble. At this moment, the phantom of the sovereign behind the pinnacle quasi-sage shouted, "Disperse." With this sound, the Qilin that had scorched time and space and distorted heaven and earth suddenly shook and collapsed into countless tiny fragments. In the end, it completely disappeared, blending into nothingness as though it had never been there. Not a bad move, but it's a pity that the user is too weak. The pinnacle quasi-sage sighed and waved his hand, causing the patriarch of the ancestral patriarch to feel dizzy. When he came back to his senses, he discovered that his neck was already gripped by a hand. His power, his physical body, his spirit, his will, his senses, everything was instantly locked down by this hand. He could not move at all, nor could he move at all. "Who are you? Why do you know me?" The pinnacle quasi-sage asked the patriarch of the ancestral patriarch in a declarative tone. When the patriarch of the ancestral patriarch heard this, his expression couldn't help but change. Just as he wanted to find some words to reply, he found that the hand shook slightly. An indescribable strange vibration passed through the hand and entered his body. As the hand shook, the patriarch of the ancestral patriarch felt an incomparable pain in his spirit, his will, his perception, and everything else. This kind of pain surpassed everything. Even though he was already at the peak of the great accomplishment quasi-sage realm and was a powerful existence that could suppress countless galaxies and space-time in his previous era, he still couldn't bear this kind of pain. He instantly opened his mouth and let out a soundless howl. When the pinnacle quasi-sage heard this howl, he frowned. Clearly, he was not satisfied. He raised his hand and shook it again. This howl was instantly suppressed. As though it was being strangled, it completely disappeared without a trace and couldn't be spat out again. It was clear that the pinnacle quasi-saint was tired of Daoist Chuan's miserable cries and had directly stopped his cries. It was not that he had stopped torturing Daoist Chuan so that he could stop his cries of pain. The patriarch of the ancestral patriarch looked at the patriarch of the ancestral patriarch and said indifferently, "You should recognize the current situation." The patriarch of the ancestral patriarch trembled and opened his mouth. It seemed as though he was letting out an earth-shattering howl. However, no sound could be heard. It was as if his voice had completely disappeared. After a long while, he felt that the pain had left him, and he finally had the ability to speak. This was obvious. It wasn't that the pinnacle quasi-sage had forgiven him. It was just that the pinnacle quasi-sage wanted him to answer his question. I've seen you before. You're one of the three masters of the universe. The patriarch of the ancestral patriarch said in a hoarse voice. 3 masters of the universe? I've thought about becoming a master of the universe, but before I could do so, I discovered the epic vortex. I barged through the vortex and arrived here. You can't have seen me become a master of the universe, the pinnacle quasi-sage said. However, although he denied the patriarch of the ancestral patriarch's words, he didn't punish the patriarch of the ancestral patriarch. This was completely different from when he found out that the patriarch of the ancestral patriarch was lying. The reason for this was simple. He could sense that the patriarch of the ancestral patriarch wasn't lying this time. The reason why he denied it was because he wanted to know more. With a thought, he lifted his hand and released the patriarch of the ancestral patriarch, allowing the patriarch of the ancestral patriarch to land lightly 3 meters in front of him. The patriarch of the ancestral patriarch felt much more relaxed now that he was no longer clutching his throat. However, the power in his body, his spirit, his will, his senses, and everything else was still suppressed by some unimaginable power. Although he seemed to have regained his freedom, he only looked slightly better than before. In reality, there wasn't much change, and he was still in the same situation. I might know what's going on. The patriarch of the ancestral patriarch could only try his best to dispel the dissatisfaction of the pinnacle quasi-sage. What happened between the patriarch of the ancestral patriarch and the pinnacle quasi-sage was witnessed by the thousands of cultivators on the Chilin Cliff. They were all extremely shocked by what happened to the patriarch of the ancestral patriarch. The fact that the patriarch of the ancestral patriarch could suppress them and make them obey his rules naturally meant that the patriarch of the ancestral patriarch was powerful enough to make them submit. However, at this moment, they found that the patriarch of the ancestral patriarch was like a baby who couldn't put up any resistance and could only be kneaded like plasticine by the newcomer. It was easy to imagine how shocking this fact was to them. At this moment, they didn't dare to discuss whether the patriarch of the ancestral patriarch knew the newcomer or why the patriarch of the ancestral patriarch treated the newcomer in such a manner. At this moment, they only had one thought, and that was for this person to calm down as soon as possible. They hoped that this person would vent his dissatisfaction and anger on Chuanzong and not transfer his anger and dissatisfaction to them. This was their only wish, and it was also the most pressing wish in their hearts. The peak quasi-sage was a self-centered cultivator, so he naturally wouldn't care about anything happening on Chilin Cliff. He stood in front of Ancestral Taoist, looked at him with an extremely condescending gaze, and said, "Speak. These era vortexes weren't created by me. They were created by the disciples of the sages, and they connect to relatively independent eras. Each of these eras connected by the era vortex had a specific period of time between them in this time period, but there is no chronological order between these eras." As the Chuanzong Taoist spoke, he was thinking about how to explain this complicated issue as concisely as possible. I see. In that case, each era is an era with a different future. Chuanzong Taoist had originally thought that he would have to explain more before the other party would understand, but he didn't expect that the peak quasi-sage would suddenly understand and point out Chuanzong Taoist's final conclusion. That's right. However, since he understood, the Chuanzong Taoist heaved a sigh of relief. He hurriedly nodded and said, "In that case, you've seen me when I became the master of the universe in your own era, and I walked into the era vortex from another future era," the peak quasi-sage said. "That should be the case. Otherwise, things wouldn't make sense," the Chuanzong Taoist said. "I see. Then, who is the disciple of the sages? And which sages are they?" The peak quasi-sage asked in the same declarative tone. When the Chuanzong Taoist was about to answer, the peak quasi-sage shifted his gaze. "That person, is he the disciple of the sages?" The Chuanzong Taoist looked in the direction of the peak quasi-sage's gaze. It was the cultivator he was looking at in the last day's hall, who was tens of thousands of miles away. It was Wu Daozi. This time, how could the sect Chuan Daoist dare to cover for Wu Daozi? He nodded. That's right. That pinnacle quasi-sage nodded. He didn't care how his sect leader Chuan answered his question and stepped forward. In an instant, he traversed tens of thousands of miles and arrived in front of the Last Day's palace. He stood beside Wu Daozi. He lowered his head and looked at Wu Daozi. He looked at Wu Daozi, who was completely focused on the Last Day's palace in front of him. He looked at Wu Daozi, who was using all kinds of mysterious magical techniques. Wu Daozi's expression was indifferent, even cold. His aura was faintly discernible, and a kind of high and mighty aura spread out. Wu Daozi paid no attention to his arrival at all. It was as if he was just a puppet, and he was still paying attention to the Last Day's palace before him. He was still using various divine abilities to deduce the profundities of the Last Day's palace. Seeing that Wu Daozi didn't seem to care about him, the pinnacle quasi-sage frowned and raised his hand to slap at Wu Daozi. This slap seemed to be a very, very ordinary slap. It did not seem to contain even the slightest bit of power, as if it did not contain anything that exceeded the scope of a normal person's slap. However, it was precisely this slap that caused an indescribable caution to surge in Wu Daozi's heart. This kind of alarm was instinctively produced when one's life was threatened. At this moment, he suddenly came back to his senses. His eyes focused, and the entire Qilin cliff trembled. In an instant, the entire void froze. The pinnacle quasi-sage felt as if his entire body had been separated from the world, from heaven and earth, from time and space. It was as if he had fallen into an incomparably strange place of nothingness. He couldn't even move the power in his body, let alone move. "You shouldn't have disturbed me," Wu Daozi said calmly. As he spoke, he raised his hand and gently flicked at the pinnacle quasi-sage. In an instant, an unimaginable force acted on the pinnacle quasi-sage's body, causing him to feel an indescribable and terrifying force to push him away. In the blink of an eye, he was already millions of miles away and crashed into a cave abode. The cave abode collapsed with a loud bang. From the inside to the outside, from top to bottom, and even from the scale of time and space, it was completely crushed into dust. The owner of this cave was a peak quasi-sage cultivator. It was because he was at this level that he dared to get close to Wu Daozi and not hide far away like the other cultivators. The moment the cave abode was smashed into dust, he finally reacted. His figure flashed, and he left the cave abode. The moment he left the cave abode, it turned into dust. Such a fact was simply a shocking terror to the cultivator, and it caused him to break out in a cold sweat. He instantly made up his mind that if he had the chance to open up his abode in the future, he would definitely open it at a place that was the furthest away from the Last Day's temple. He could not continue staying here. As he was thinking about this, he moved even faster toward the furthest point on Qilin Cliff. The peak quasi-sage was knocked away by Wu Daozi. Even the cave abode he crashed into had such a change, so one could imagine how great the blow he suffered was. At this moment, he was lying on the ruins of the cave abode, or rather, on the dust of the cave abode. He opened his eyes in a daze, and his expression was one of extreme shock. How is this possible? That was the same power. I was able to easily block it before, so why was I easily subdued this time? This was the only thought that flashed through this person's mind. After thinking for a while, he finally understood. This was the true power of that power. The reason he was able to block that power so easily was not because the power was too weak, but because the cultivator using this power was too weak. He simply couldn't unleash the power of this power, as expected of a disciple of a sage. After understanding this, the peak quasi-sage slowly stood up and sighed in admiration. At this moment, there was no part of his body that didn't hurt. It was difficult to gather the power within his body, and his mind was in a mess. His body could collapse at any moment. At this moment, not to mention fighting, just standing up had already exhausted all of his efforts, and he was almost unable to complete it. To be able to become a peak quasi-sage in the cultivation desert of the future, your comprehension is truly impressive. However, that is all. Compared to a true peak quasi-sage, you still have a lot to learn. At this moment, Wu Daozi's voice entered his ears. Chapter 10:26. I'm not as good as you, the peak quasi-sage said as he straightened his body with difficulty. As punishment for your impudence in my Dao field, in the next 100,000 years, you will open up 100 million cave abodes in Qilin Cliff. These cave abodes must be one with the entire Qilin Cliff without a single crack. Can you do that? Wu Daozi said to the peak quasi-sage. I'm not willing, the peak quasi-sage said plainly. Wu Daozi raised his eyebrows and asked, Aren't you afraid of death? Of course I'm afraid of death. However, compared to having a dusty Dao heart and being unable to pursue supreme transcendence, death isn't something I can't accept, the peak quasi-sage said plainly. Although he looked to be in such a sorry state, there was still an indescribable pride on his body. That pride was like a peerless emperor who controlled the world, a heart that would never change even if it was covered in dust and was in trouble. The Dao heart was a very mysterious and very personal existence. For some cultivators, occasionally lowering their heads and yielding to power wouldn't affect their Dao heart at all. In fact, they might even gain a clearer understanding of themselves, and their Dao heart would become firmer. However, for some cultivators, every time they lowered their heads and yielded to power would be a devastating blow to their Dao heart, cutting off their future path of cultivation. Clearly, the ancestral Taoist and the peak quasi-sage were the first and second types of cultivators. For the ancestral Taoist, occasionally lowering his head was already a habit for him. Occasionally surrendering to power had already become a habit for him. No matter how he surrendered or how he lowered his head, it wouldn't affect his Dao heart in the slightest. On the contrary, it would allow him to have a clearer understanding of himself, let him know the limits of his strength, and let him understand exactly where he stood. In this way, his Dao heart would become even firmer. This kind of determination allowed his cultivation level to rise continuously within the limits of his understanding. Of course, but it was still within the limits of his understanding. It was beyond the limits of his understanding. If he wanted to break through, if he wanted to improve, the difficulty would become extremely difficult. This was also the most essential difference between the two types of cultivators. In comparison, this peak sage-to-be would rather die than submit to him, although it was very likely that he would die because of an irresistible force. But if it could grow up smoothly, in the future, they would be many times more powerful than the first type of cultivators. Wu Daozi looked at the expression of the peak quasi-sage and knew that this was his Dao heart. If he really forced him to do this, he wouldn't be able to do it. He might really rather die than comply. For a moment, he couldn't help but sigh in admiration. No wonder he was able to reach the pinnacle of quasi-sage in the cultivation desert of the future. He actually has such a heart of Dao. Such a thought flashed through Wu Daozi's mind. Although he was full of admiration, he did not give up on the thought of punishing this peak sage-to-be. Although he hadn't gained much from studying the Last Days Palace all these years, he wasn't willing to give up. According to his original plan, he should have continued to study it, and one day, he would have gained enlightenment and seen through the mysteries of the Last Days Palace. Then, he would have known why the Last Days Palace was able to surpass the divine calculation technique his master had taught him. At this moment, because of the disturbance of the peak quasi-sage, he had broken out of that state. If he wanted to enter that state again, he would have to spend tens of thousands of years to immerse himself in it. Otherwise, it would be impossible. In this way, it was equivalent to interrupting his process of comprehending the profundities of the Last Days Hall. So, it was obvious what sort of loss it was to him, and it was obvious how furious he was. Under such circumstances, how could Wu Daozi give up on punishing the peak quasi-sage? If that's the case, I won't be polite with you, Wu Daozi said calmly. With that, he raised his hand and pressed it down on the peak quasi-sage. This pressure did not contain much destructive power. Instead, it contained a suppressive power. It was a power that could suppress everything and even the will of the opponent. Under the suppression of this power, Even a peak quasi-sage would not be able to break free. He could only allow his opponent to suppress everything about him. In the end, he could either be turned into a puppet and be controlled by the suppressor, or he could be completely suppressed and cut off from the outside world, making it impossible for him to transcend. After all, the peak quasi-sage was a peak quasi-sage. When he saw this power pressing down on him, he sensed that it was a suppressive power and not a destructive power. However, with his pride, how could he not react and allow his opponent to suppress him? He roared, and a strange nine-dragon seal shot out from the top of his head. The seal pointed straight at the palm that Wu Dao Zi was slapping down with. Wu Dao Zi frowned. Then, a mocking smile appeared on his face. With a thought, the palm that was pressing down shook slightly. In an instant, a mysterious and profound change occurred. After this change, the suppressive power underwent an inexplicable change along with the change in his palm. This change instantly caused the suppressive power to give birth to an extremely firm and powerful will. The surrounding space seemed to have turned into glass in that instant. The moment the power passed through it, everything turned into powder and shattered. It was as if it had turned into endless glass shards in the blink of an eye. After these space-time shards formed, they did not disappear. Instead, they condensed around the power. Following the essence of the power, they condensed into a will. Like a palm made of space-time shards, it pressed down on the seal and the peak quasi-sage below it. The peak quasi-sage roared, and the power around him surged. Then, the huge figure of a king appeared behind him again. However, this time, it was only the figure that existed. Although there was no change in its essence, because it was facing Wu Daozi, the true owner of the Qilin Cliff, the mysterious transformation of its own kingdom could not be displayed. He looked like a ruler who had lost his country. After taking shape, the emperor grabbed the imperial seal that the peak quasi-sage had just slapped out with one hand. Holding the imperial seal, the emperor charged upwards and hurled it at the huge palm made of space-time fragments. Both of them were extremely fast, as if they did not need to experience any time at all. They appeared and collided almost at the same time. After the collision, in an instant, the entire Qilin Cliff seemed to shake. The 10 suns in the void also seemed to shake subtly. It seemed like the whole world was affected by this collision. This was, of course, impossible. The reason why such a miraculous scene appeared was none other than that very instant. The space-time above Qilin Cliff changed inexplicably because of this vibration. As a result, the reflected heaven and earth produced such a change. In other words, the change happened. It was not the heaven and earth, but the feeling of the cultivators on Qilin Cliff. Peak Sage to Be is indeed powerful. Everyone who sensed the changes in the area was shocked. All the cultivators on Qilin Cliff exclaimed inwardly. They felt like they had become ants, affected by the aftermath of the battle. They even felt like they had turned into leaves in the air or duckweed in the water. They had not felt this for many years. Even when they faced the patriarch Taoist, who forced them to submit to his rules, they only felt that they were inferior. If they did not submit, there would be terrible consequences, and it was very likely that they would suffer irrecoverable injuries. However, they had never felt that if the aftermath of the battle was just a little bit stronger, they would be completely erased from the world of space-time. In this way, for the first time, they had a clear understanding of how powerful the peak of the Sage-to-Be realm was. For the first time, they knew how powerful the realm they wanted to pursue was and how long the road they had to walk on was. The result of the collision between Wu Daozi and the peak quasi-sage was not hard to guess. Even though Wu Daozi had only casually slapped, his cultivation realm was higher than that of the peak of quasi-sage. Moreover, this was his place of enlightenment. The power of this slap might not have been his full strength, but it was at least 1/10 of his full strength. This 1/10 of the power was already an unbearable power for the peak quasi-sage. Although the pinnacle quasi-sage had made some progress and even pulled out his own seal, he still lost all ability to resist the impact. The Emperor Phantom collapsed, and the Imperial Seal lost all its light in the process. It looked like an ordinary Imperial Seal without any power, and it fell to the ground powerlessly. After the collision, Wu Daozi's expression did not change at all. On the other hand, the peak quasi-sage's expression was extremely gloomy. It was as if half of his body had been dissected. He stood there with his aura in chaos, and the power in his body continuously seeped out of his acupoints. As a peak quasi-saint, his strength had long broken through a certain limit. Once it was out of his control, it would naturally give birth to all sorts of strange wills that would constantly evolve and transform in the void, turning into all sorts of special creatures that would disperse in all directions. If left alone, these creatures would continue to grow and eventually grow into powerful cultivators. In the end, they could bring disaster to the world or benefit the world. However, it was clear that Wu Daozi would not let these creatures leave at will. After all, this was his Dao field. Although these creatures could benefit the Dao field, as long as there was a possibility of them causing disaster, he would not take the risk of letting them perish on their own. With a thought, the force that had not lost much after the previous collision suddenly pressed down. Not only did it press down on the pinnacle of the sage-to-be, but it also completely enveloped the force that was dispersing in all directions. Then, it returned to the acupoints of the pinnacle of the sage-to-be in its original position, as if it had never appeared in the outside world. The peak quasi-sage's entire body trembled violently. The divine light in his eyes flickered continuously. It was numb, angry, pleasantly surprised, and desperate. The entire process lasted for dozens of breaths before it gradually calmed down. When everything calmed down, the peak quasi-sage's expression became numb. The light in his eyes became extremely dull, as if they were carved out of stone. There was no vitality, and no intelligence at all. "Greetings, Master." The peak quasi-sage bowed toward Wu Daozi and said sluggishly, "Go to Qilin Cliff and open up 100 million caves. Your aura must be one with Qilin Cliff. There cannot be any disharmony," Wu Daozi said to the peak quasi-sage, who seemed to have turned into a puppet. The peak quasi-sage's expression did not change at all. He only responded with a yes. Then, he took a step forward and arrived in the sky above Qilin Cliff. He looked down at the seemingly boundless Qilin Cliff. What a pity. After being suppressed, even though his intelligence and memories are not damaged, his subjective initiative is still a bit lacking. He still has to watch from the side and grasp the general direction. Otherwise, there is a high chance that some kind of messy situation will occur. Wu Daozi sighed like this. What happened before his eyes? It was not something else. The real Wu Daozi used his powerful suppression power to suppress everything about the peak quasi-sage. It completely suppressed the pinnacle quasi-sage, completely suppressing his strength and will. His body and everything else was under his absolute control. This suppression was different from the suppression that completely restricted his freedom. In fact, this kind of suppression was like wiping away his own intelligence and adding a brand new will to his mind. Although this willpower was newly constructed, it was rooted in the memories of the peak of the sage-to-be. It was equivalent to possessing all the power and knowledge of the peak of the sage-to-be. If Wu Daozi's willpower was of a certain realm, it would naturally not be much different from the peak of the sage-to-be. In comparison, perhaps it would only be lacking a little bit of subjective initiative. Seeing that the peak quasi-sage had started to open up his cave, Wu Daozi turned to look at the last day's palace that he had been studying for tens of thousands of years and sighed. He knew that he could only allow this thing that he could not understand to remain in his cave. Previously, he could completely abandon his original plan to comprehend the mysteries within. However, after the incident with the peak quasi-sage, he could not do so no matter how ambitious he was. If there was a peak quasi-sage, there might be a second or third. If this happened from time to time, he might not be able to comprehend the mysteries of the last day's palace. He might even fail the task that his master gave him. If that was the case, it would be troublesome. After sighing, he calmed himself down and took a step forward. In an instant, he had already traversed tens of thousands of miles and arrived at the edge of Qilin Cliff. He was facing the 100 million whirlpools in the sea of clouds. The ancestral Taoist was carefully looking around. The moment Wu Daozi appeared, the ancestral Taoist noticed his arrival and was shocked. He hurriedly bowed and said, "Junior has let Senior down and allowed that cultivator to disturb Senior. Please punish me." Since the ancestral Taoist called Wu Daozi Senior, he naturally referred to himself as Junior. This was something that was extremely natural. "You have already done very well. That cultivator was a peak quasi-sage. It is natural that you were unable to do anything," Wu Daozi said calmly. "Who is that peak quasi-sage? How do you know him?" Wu Daozi thought for a moment and asked. When the ancestral Taoist heard this, his expression changed slightly. After a while, he sighed and said, "Junior lived in the era of the ruler. In the universe at that time, there were 3 masters of the universe, and he was one of them. He was known as the Central Sacred Lord and controlled billions of galaxies in the center of the universe. He had countless stars and planets, and countless cultivators under him. Junior accidentally offended him and was chased through half the universe. In the end, I couldn't take it anymore and entered the whirlpools of time and came here." "I see. Although this person seems to be the same person, in reality, he doesn't come from the same era as the Prime Saint Lord. Or perhaps, compared to now, he doesn't come from the same future." Wu Daozi's thoughts moved quickly, and he instantly guessed the truth. Senior is very knowledgeable. That should be the case. The Central Sacred Lord doesn't know me at all and doesn't know that he is the Central Sacred Lord. According to him, he wanted to become the master of the universe, but before he could do anything, he entered the whirlpools of time and came here. The ancestral Taoist said in admiration, "That's good. This person almost destroyed the Qilin Cliff, so I will punish him to open 100 million caves on the Qilin Cliff. You're familiar with the other cultivators, so go and arrange for them to live in different caves according to their strength." Wu Daozi nodded his head and put aside this issue. He then said to the sect inheritor. When the ancestral Taoist heard this, his expression changed and his eyes brightened. This was a good job. Allocating resources was a good job, no matter what world or era it was. If he did it well, he would be able to obtain shocking benefits. Of course, if not done well, one would be viewed as an enemy or even hated by others. However, although the ancestral Taoist was not as arrogant as the Central Sacred Lord, as a peak grand completion quasi-sage, he was naturally confident and didn't think that he could do this job badly. When he heard Wu Daozi's words, he was naturally overjoyed. "Junior understands. I will do my best to complete this task." He quickly expressed his determination to Wu Daozi. Wu Daozi waved his hand and signaled for him to handle this matter. He turned to look at the 100 million whirlpools of time and began to comprehend the whirlpools of time again. There was some kind of pressure in his heart. Even when he ignored everything on the Qilin Cliff to comprehend the mysteries of the Last Days Hall, it was because of this pressure. Chapter 10:27. It was precisely because Luo Fan was able to do such a thing on Qilin Cliff that Wu Daozi felt worried. He was worried that Luo Fan would surpass him and turn the tables on him, making his plan a gift for him. This worry transformed into a powerful pressure that made it difficult for him to maintain his composure. That was why he'd completely disregarded his mission on Qilin Cliff in the past tens of thousands of years and wholeheartedly wanted to figure out the changes in the Last Days Palace caused by Luo Fan. It was because of this pressure that he was so angry after being disturbed by the Central Sacred Master. He even suppressed him and wanted him to open 100 million caves on Qilin Cliff. The 100 million caves were not essential to Wu Daozi. It did not matter if he had them or not. If he had them, he would make the power of Qilin Cliff operate more smoothly. If he didn't, it would not affect Qilin Cliff much. The matter of opening up a cave abode was actually more of a punishment for the so-called Central Sacred Master. I'm a disciple of a sage. Why would I be afraid of a rogue cultivator like you? Not to mention that you're only a great perfection quasi-sage. Even if you were a peak quasi-sage, I would not lose to you. As long as I cultivate according to my own method, I will naturally achieve the best results. I will not be afraid of you. This was what Wu Daozi was thinking. It was because of this thought that he sat at the edge of Qilin Cliff and faced the 100 million era vortexes in front of him. He waited for the cultivators to break through the transcendent path and arrive at this point in time. As for how the ancestral Taoist would arrange the caves of the cultivators, whether or not he would gain any benefits from it, or whether or not there would be any enmity between them, these were matters of another world to him, and had nothing to do with him. Everything outside stabilized after the various changes. Inside the three-dimensional talisman, shaped like the Hall of the Last Days, Luo Fan was reading an article about the Way of the Sage in the midst of a mysterious aura. The Sage realm was a realm that could not be described with words. To describe the Way of the Sage, it could only be an endless article. Even if it was 1,000,000,000 words, it would not have an ending. Luo Fan looked at the article in front of him. His mind sank into some kind of mysterious state. Suddenly, he seemed to have understood something. Sometimes, it felt like he had not comprehended anything. Sometimes, it felt like he had seen some supreme truth of heaven and earth. Sometimes, it felt like the supreme truth of heaven and earth was completely wrong. It was a kind of wrong path. Such changes were happening all the time. This caused his heart to be in an indescribable agitation. In such a process, time passed slowly. After an unknown period of time, it seemed like 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years. One day, Luo Fan's figure, which seemed to have transformed into a strange world, returned to human form. After he recovered, he let out a long breath, raised his hand, and clapped. The article that was made up of billions of characters suddenly shrank, shrinking into a thick, huge book in front of him, quietly floating there. After doing all this, his face was slightly pale. The power in his body was surging like boiling water, and he could hardly control it. Even his aura could not be suppressed as it spread in all directions. Not only did it fill up the runic void where he was, but it also spread towards the runic voids in both the macro and micro directions, causing the hundreds of runic voids to change in appearance. Countless strange lights and shadows appeared to be crazily moving about, as if they were evolving all sorts of unimaginable mysteries, and also seemed to be displaying all sorts of irreconcilable contradictions and conflicts. Luo Fan slowly closed his eyes with a strong will and began to calm his body and mind. This process lasted for more than 100,000 years. During this process, the changes in the aura kept shrinking. Finally, it was not known when it had completely converged on his body, causing all the strange phenomena around him to disappear. At the same time, the power in his body completely calmed down, and the chaos that had occurred before could not be seen at all. After all these changes subsided, his whole body was like a statue floating in the void, motionless. Until today, there was not the slightest change. Today, after more than 100,000 years since he began to calm his body and mind, his body finally underwent an inexplicable change. A faint vitality began to leak from his body. The appearance of this life force did not cause his appearance to change, but the existence of this life force allowed him to change from his statue-like appearance to that of a cultivator. A living, powerful cultivator with supreme willpower. It's still too difficult. With a long sigh, Luo Fan slowly opened his eyes. There seemed to be countless strange lights and shadows flashing in his eyes, but it seemed that nothing had changed. It was just a simple black pupil. After reading the article about the Way of the Sage, and after more than 100,000 years of calming his body and mind, at this moment, he had changed a little compared to before. In his feeling, the realm shackles that shackled his cultivation realm and prevented him from breaking through the transcendent realm to the Tao Master realm had been weakened again at this time, and he could faintly see the hope of breaking through them. However, compared to the last time, this time he spent more time and read more articles, but his progress was not as good as the last time. Although the difference was not too big, it was more because he spent more time and energy, and the efficiency was much lower than the last time. If this trend continued, the next time he was afraid that he would have to spend more time and read more articles about the Way of the Sage to achieve the same progress this time. In this way, If he really wanted to break through the transcendent realm to become a Tao master, the time needed was probably more than 10 times longer than he expected. But he could not help but sigh. After the sigh, a faint smile appeared on his face. Compared to weakening the bottleneck, it became more and more difficult. Unconsciously, he had a deeper understanding of the aura rune structure. At this moment, if he wanted to pass through the rune void in the macro and micro directions, it was many times easier than before. Almost any step could cross tens of millions of layers of the rune void. Such a change was many times stronger than the previous 100,000 layers of the rune void. This was almost a classic example of planting flowers intentionally but not blossoming, but planting a willow unintentionally grew shade. At first, he wanted to find the mystery of the rune structure, but he could not find it. In the end, he had no choice but to change his goal. Now, reading this article about the way of the sage was to break through the realm shackles that he encountered, and he did not have the mood to care about the mystery of the aura rune structure. In the end, the biggest gain. Instead, it was the mystery of the aura rune structure. After calming himself down, Luo Fan lifted his foot and took a light step, directly crossing the largest layer of the rune void that he could cross in the micro direction. He came to a seemingly familiar place, but there were many details of the rune void that he had never seen before. He came to this place. He spread out his perception and directly integrated all the rune void that he could perceive into his mind using the basic and unique order of the 99 layers of runes. With another turn, he managed to condense hundreds of thousands of strange golden characters. He then inserted these runes into the article about the way of the sage in front of him and connected them to the end of the article, completely connecting them with the article. Then, he did not stop and took another step. After stopping, he repeated the previous action again. Just like that, he constantly traversed the void of runes, constantly obtaining more and more words to inscribe into the article. This process did not just last for a few years, decades, centuries, or even thousands or tens of thousands of years. It went on for millions of years. During these millions of years, Luo Fan kept taking steps to obtain characters and insert them into the article. Every single time, he would obtain hundreds of thousands or even millions of characters. This process lasted for millions of years, and the number of characters he obtained had reached an unimaginable level. In fact, it was difficult to clearly describe how many characters there were even in terms of numbers. If he still used the method he used before, which was to directly compress them into a book and store them, the book could even be so huge that it would completely fill up the rune void. Of course, this was impossible. Therefore, during these millions of years, Luo Fan used his understanding of these characters to directly refine a strange magic treasure that was the size of a door and had a surface that looked like a book. He directly inserted the article, which even surpassed the limit that could be described by numbers, into the magic treasure, and thus became like a strange tablet that could appear on the surface of the magic treasure in sections. This saved Luo Fan the trouble of storing a huge number of books. One day, Luo Fan, who had repeated the same thing for millions of years, suddenly felt a little tired, and he had some resistance to continuing to do it. In an instant, Luo Fan understood that it was no longer necessary to continue collecting characters. The resistance and weariness that came from doing the same thing over and over again was unavoidable for any living being. Ordinary people would probably deeply resist and be tired of doing it for 10 days to half a month, let alone a million years. Luo Fan had been able to do this for millions of years, and his patience and mind were already so powerful that it was astonishing. However, this was also where his opportunity lay. Due to such a conflicted mentality, he would be more immersed in comprehending the path of the saint's essay, which would allow him to gain more benefits from it. The reason for this was not complicated. This resistance to continuing to do this would make Luo Fan understand that if he did not achieve his goal this time, he would have to continue doing things that would make him feel conflicted and tired. In this way, he would naturally be focused. In fact, this resistance and weariness was also caused by Luo Fan on purpose. Why did he keep doing this over and over again for 1,000,000 years, and not like the first 2 times? He just started to comprehend and study after collecting a considerable number of characters, just to wait for this mentality to appear. The article that described the path of the sage was endless. This fact meant that if Luo Fan was willing, he could continue to comprehend this article that described the way of the saints endlessly, until the end of time, until the end of the world. It was obvious. The article that described the path of the sage was right in front of Luo Fan. It was as if there was an endless treasure placed in front of an ordinary person. If ordinary people thought that the treasure was endless, and that as long as they took action, they would definitely be able to dig out enough treasures for their own use. In that case, they would naturally not cherish the treasures that they dug out. Naturally, they would not be able to fully unleash the potential of the treasure. And they would not be able to fully unleash the potential of the treasure. If they wanted to build a financial empire, if they wanted to change the world and create the future, they would naturally not even think about it. The ultimate possibility. He was afraid that he would just eat and wait for death, accomplishing nothing. For Luo Fan, if he felt that this article contained all the mysteries he wanted, he would naturally get what he wanted as long as he continued to comprehend it. But what awaited him was that he would never be able to reach his desired goal and break the shackles of his realm to become a Dao Master. This was the fundamental reason why Luo Fan's second comprehension of this article was much less than the first time. At this moment, with this kind of resistance and weariness, the situation was naturally different. Although this article was endless, there were as many words as one wanted. But to him, the only things he could use were the ones in his hands. Even though the number was indescribable, it was limited after all, and it would naturally be able to prevent him from achieving nothing in the future. Luo Fan slowly closed his eyes and quietly adjusted his breathing. He calmed his mind and tried hard to adjust his physical and mental state to the peak. This process lasted for another 100 years. After 100 years, the influence on his body and mind of repeating the same thing for the previous 1,000,000 years had been completely eliminated, except for the resistance and tiredness to continue. His whole body and mind had completely recovered to the peak state. Finally, I can start. Luo Fan opened his eyes that had been closed for 100 years, and a faint smile appeared on his face. Looking at the boundless void around him, he felt a little uncomfortable. His mind slightly moved, and he raised his hand to point forward. In an instant, 990,000 three-dimensional talismans directly rushed out in front of him, and suddenly gathered in front of him, condensing into a stone house. This stone house looked very simple and unadorned, as if it had existed for hundreds of millions of years and would continue to exist for hundreds of millions of years. The construction method of these 990,000 three-dimensional talismans was extremely mysterious. There was me and you and me. The outermost looked like a huge three-dimensional talisman, but deep inside, this three-dimensional talisman seemed to be made up of countless other three-dimensional talismans, and those three-dimensional talismans that formed this three-dimensional talisman seemed to be made up of other three-dimensional talismans. This went on like this for 99 layers, and finally, the power that Luo Fan used to build the 990,000 three-dimensional talismans was finally revealed. This was what Luo Fan had comprehended about the structure of the aura talismans. The construction method of these 99 layers of three-dimensional talismans was much stronger than the three-dimensional talismans that he had used before. If he had wanted to build the stone house formed by the 99 layers of three-dimensional talismans before he had comprehended the structure of the aura talismans, he was afraid that even 990,000 three-dimensional talismans would not be enough. Now, it was done with 990,000 three-dimensional talismans. However, it was only compared to him in the past. Compared to the rune structure in the aura that he was in, the structure of the 99 layers of three-dimensional talismans could not even be mentioned in the same breath. The difference between the two was like heaven and earth. The structure of the aura talismans was also made up of 99 layers of runes, but these runes could form a void on their own, and the structure between each layer was natural, as if it was made by heaven. Moreover, the final structure that was formed had endless layers, and even the sequence of the runes was describing an extremely complete article about the way of the sage. In contrast, the 99 layers of three-dimensional talismans that Luo Fan built were simply piled up. The traces of chiseling were extremely obvious, and it did not have any natural char at all. Each layer of the 3D talisman was a separate layer of 3D talisman. The space inside the stone house was created by the combination of the 99 layers of 3D talisman. Not to mention, the sequence of the 99 layers of 3D talisman did not contain any other secrets. It was just a simple combination of the 99 layers of 3D talisman. The huge difference could be seen at a glance. Looking at the three-dimensional talismans, Luo Fan was not dissatisfied at this time. Even if it was not as good as the structure of the aura talismans, it was after all a great improvement compared to before. One could be dissatisfied, but one could not be dissatisfied. Luo Fan smiled and raised his hand gently, and the door of the stone house opened automatically. He lifted his foot and stepped into the door. There was no special mystery in the stone house, and it was just a simple stone house with some simple furniture. It looked like a simple study. Luo Fan came behind the desk and raised his hand to put the door-sized jade book on the table. The jade book automatically adjusted according to the area of the table and became a 16-page book quietly placed in front of him. Chapter 10:28. As Luo Fan read the article, time passed by slowly. This time, he was even more engrossed. Instead, the phenomenon produced when he was reading was compressed in his body, and he did not seem to have the same strange phenomenon as the previous two times. Of course, in addition to these strange scenes, the flickering light in Luo Fan's eyes faintly contained endless strange phenomena, as if they were evolving into endless mysterious mysteries. The jade book in his hand continued to flip its pages as he thought about it. The words recorded on it continued to fuse with his mind, and the mysteries contained within were continuously being deciphered by him. This time, Luo Fan spent a lot more time reading the remaining words than the previous two times. The previous two times had only taken him a few thousand years. This time, when he finally finished reading all the words in the article, millions of years had passed. Such a long period of time was thousands of times longer than the previous few millennia. This was because during this time, Luo Fan did not slow down like before. Instead, he worked hard to speed up. From this, it could be seen that the number of words he had added to the book this time was much more than the number he had added at the beginning. One day, after millions of years, the stone house that Luo Fan was in, which was made up of 99 layers of three-dimensional talismans, trembled slightly before collapsing with a loud bang. They transformed into countless three-dimensional talismans that floated in the void, like clouds that were surging endlessly. Amidst the cloud formed by the three-dimensional talisman seals, a ray of light appeared from nothing, from faint to dense. Under this brilliance, the cloud-like three-dimensional talismans started to churn endlessly. In the end, it gradually condensed into a brand new appearance, which turned into a platform. It was a circular platform that was tens of thousands of meters wide. The surface of the platform was extremely smooth, and one could not even tell that it was made of three-dimensional talismans. One could only see that it seemed to be made of some inseparable, strange material. There was no one on the platform at the moment. Only that strange light radiated outwards. This ray of light was extremely mysterious. Its color couldn't even be clearly distinguished by color. One could only know that it was a ray of light, a strange ray of light that contained boundless profundities. There was an inexplicable charm to this ray of light. It looked as if some kind of existence was working hard to break through some kind of barrier, some kind of shackle. This ray of light continued to radiate in all directions, from the original location of the platform. After a few breaths, it had already enveloped the entire runic void, filling every corner of the runic void and enveloping every single rune within the runic void. But all it did was wrap around the runes. The light didn't penetrate into the runes. After wrapping around the runes, it didn't go any deeper. It was as if the runes were just runes, and there were no other runes forming them. This was the case in a microscopic perspective. In a macroscopic perspective, the light did not continue to rise. It was as if the runic void wasn't the runic void that formed a rune, but the outermost layer of the entire rune structure. There were no more layers above it. In other words, this mysterious ray of light directly treated the runic void as the entire world. It was as if the entire world didn't exist except for the runic void. After filling the entire runic void, the strange light seemed to be counterattacked by some kind of power. It began to roll back from its limit and condense on the platform again. After a few breaths, it condensed into an oval ball on the platform again. It looked like a cocoon of light or a huge egg. After condensing into such a form, the light was once again affected by some kind of power. It suddenly exploded and spread in all directions. It continued until it reached the end of the void and rolled back again. In this way, it spread out and filled the void, filling every corner of the world. When it shrank, it formed an oval ball on the platform. As it expanded and shrank, it seemed like some kind of strange heart was beating. It also seemed like some kind of strange creature was breathing in and out again and again. It seemed like it was trying hard to create some kind of strange existence, or like it was gathering its power to break something. The entire process continued. 2 hours, 4 hours, 1 day, 2 days, 1 month, 2 months, 1 year, 2 years. In the end, the situation only changed on the 9,999 year, when there was only a year left until 10,000 years. During the 9,999 years, the luster had also expanded and shrunk, but the speed at which it expanded and shrunk was constantly increasing as time passed. When it reached the 9,999 year mark, the speed at which it expanded and shrank had reached an unimaginable level. At a glance, the light seemed to be constantly filling the entire runic void, and also seemed to be constantly condensing on the platform to form an oval ball of light. Clearly, the speed at which it expanded and shrank had almost exceeded the limit of what the eyes of living beings could distinguish. On this day, the light suddenly paused. In an instant, it was fixed in that oval shape. In fact, under this shape, it even started to compress and solidify. In the end, when it was compressed to the size of a speck of dust, an earth-shattering explosion occurred. In an instant, this brilliance spread out in all directions in a manner that was countless times greater than that of the previous 9,999 years, creating an effect that was akin to an earth-shattering explosion. When the explosion occurred, the entire void of runes was enveloped in a brilliant brilliance. This brilliance concealed everything. It covered everything. It almost had the charm of the light produced when a cultivator walked the path of transcendence in the era vortex and arrived at this point in time. It had to be said that the light produced by the era vortex was the light of the era tide, and it represented the mystery of the era tide. For this light to have such charm, it clearly meant that, at least in a certain aspect, this light was already on the same level as the mystery of the era tide. Of course, it was only in a certain aspect. After all, the era tide was a mechanism of the world that even sages had to give way to, so how could it be so easy to compare with it? The light shone for a long time before gradually fading away. After all the light faded away, at the place that had existed for 9,999 years. This was because a young man had appeared on the circular platform formed by the light condensing into a three-dimensional talisman. It was a very young and handsome young man. He was Luo Fan. At this moment, he was exuding an aura of supremacy and nobility. It was as if he was above the entire world. It was an aura that was above the universe and the great Tao. This aura caused the surrounding space-time to change naturally. It seemed as if it was naturally obedient and did not need his control. It was naturally dependent on him. If this space-time had a will, it was obviously happy because of his existence and sad because of his departure. Luo Fan stood on this platform at this time. His mind was full of peace and contentment. An indescribable sense of freedom, perfection, and freedom filled his mind. With a slight shift of his mind, an extremely condensed long river of the great Tao suddenly appeared above his head. This long river of the great Tao only appeared for a moment before it suddenly burrowed into the void and directly broke through the layer of rules and laws. Even though this was the interior of the aura rune structure, since there was time and space, there was naturally a layer of rules and laws that was not much different from the outside world. It entered the void under the layer of rules and laws. Then, it gently broke through this layer of nothingness and entered the unseen world, side by side with the great Tao in the unseen world. This long river of the great Tao was naturally insignificant and insignificant compared to the great Tao. It even felt that if the great Tao shook slightly, it would be enough to completely crush this long river of the great Tao into nothingness. However, although this long river of the great Tao was so insignificant and insignificant compared to the great Tao of heaven and earth, after all, it was already independent and could already stand side by side with the great Tao. This meant that this long river of the great Tao, in essence, was already not much different from the great Tao of heaven and earth. A cultivator who could condense a long river of the great Tao was certainly above the long river of the great Tao. And this long river of the great Tao was not much different from the real great Tao in essence. Being able to occasionally surpass the long river of the great Tao naturally meant that its essence was already above Lin Jiayu's great Tao. Such a cultivator was the supreme of the great Tao. Such a realm was the Tao Master Realm. Obviously, Luo Fan had finally broken the realm shackles that originally shackled his realm breakthrough through reading the article about the Sage's Way and after hundreds of years of hard work. He had truly surpassed the transcendent realm and achieved the Tao Master Realm that he had been dreaming of. There was only one realm left before he reached the Sage Realm that he had been pursuing. The breakthrough in the cultivation realm had almost brought earth-shaking changes to Luo Fan. He felt that everything about him was tens of thousands of times stronger than before. That feeling was like he could destroy his body and soul with just a glance, and even completely erase all traces of his existence in all time and space. Moreover, more importantly, he felt that there was still endless room for improvement in front of him. The feeling that previously existed that no matter how hard he cultivated, it was impossible to make further progress, and no matter how hard he tried, he would always stay in the original cultivation realm, had completely disappeared. Obviously, this feeling was brought about by breaking through the bottleneck and stepping into a new realm. As long as he had not reached the limit of this realm and had not encountered the realm shackles of this realm, this feeling would not change, and he would always be able to continue to make progress with his own cultivation. Floating above the void, Luo Fan looked up, and the boundless rune void in front of him had inexplicably changed in his eyes. The rune void was still the rune void. However, the scenes in the front, back, left, and right of the runic void were completely different. On the left and right, there were runic void after runic void arranged in an endless manner, without beginning or end. In the front and back, there was a vague sea of clouds and a sky. This sea of clouds was the sea of clouds under the Chelan Cliff, the sea of clouds that appeared in the three-dimensional talisman. And the sky was the sky above the Chelan Cliff. It was also the sky that was reflected in the three-dimensional talisman. Obviously, after becoming a Tao Master, he could already rely on his own eyes to see through the endless aura rune structure in front of him, and he could see the scene inside the three-dimensional talisman outside the aura. Sure enough, a flower planted intentionally doesn't bloom. An unintentional willow grows into a shade. Luo Fan sighed leisurely. He knew that he had achieved a breakthrough in the cultivation realm by reading the article about the Way of the Sage. Naturally, he had a new understanding of the aura rune structure, and finally, he directly saw through some of the mysteries of the aura rune structure, although he dare not say that he could completely master it. But it had already allowed him to see through the shackles of the rune void and see the scene outside the aura. For an existence like Luo Fan, as long as he could see it, he could naturally reach it by various means, not to mention that he was already a Tao Master. even if he was a primordial zenith heaven cultivator who was billions of times weaker than he was now. Now that he had become a Tao master, it was naturally a matter of thought for him to reach the place he could see. At this time, Luo Fan had already accomplished both his immediate and final purpose in this rune void, so he didn't have any thoughts of staying here any longer. With a slight thought, the long river of the Great Way that was side by side with the Great Way trembled slightly and naturally disappeared without a trace, but was taken back by him. After taking back the long river of the Great Way, he took a light step forward, and in a flash he had already left the endless aura rune structure and directly appeared in the three-dimensional talisman. As for the three-dimensional talisman he left in the rune void, it naturally collapsed at this time, turned into power, and was directly swallowed by the rune void, absorbed into the infinite rune structure, and disappeared without a trace. The instant Luo Fan left the rune void, the three-dimensional talisman that had turned into an illusory shadow, which was the last day's palace in the eyes of the outside world, instantly trembled and returned to its original appearance. It was still a solid palace, and it was still a solid three-dimensional talisman. At the moment of this change, Wu Daozi, who was sitting cross-legged on the edge of Qilin Cliff, shook his body, and his eyes emitted a frightening light. In a flash, he had already appeared directly in front of the three-dimensional talisman. Finally, there is a change. Let me see what mystery you have. Wu Daozi thought to himself and raised his hand to lightly press the three-dimensional talisman in front of him. A supreme force was generated out of thin air, rushing towards the three-dimensional talisman, which was the door of the Hall of the Last Days. This force contained the shocking power of Qilin Cliff, and it was many times more powerful than when he easily subdued the Central Divine Lord. In an instant, it hit the three-dimensional talisman. It was a loud bang. The three-dimensional talisman shook in an instant and directly turned into countless small three-dimensional talismans. Like clouds being blown by a strong wind, they instantly rushed towards the opposite side, like sand being swept up by a strong wind. Under such an attack, the void opened up inside the three-dimensional talisman, collapsed in an instant, and completely turned into nothingness. Luo Fan was aware of this attack the moment it arrived. He originally planned to block it, but after thinking about it, he integrated the aura he had cut off from the Enlightenment futon into the universe in the sleeve. He only slightly guided the space-time to protect himself, and let the Hall of the Last Days, which was made up of three-dimensional talismans, be directly slapped into countless small three-dimensional talismans that scattered in all directions. The power that Wu Daozi used to slap the three-dimensional talisman was not just a simple slap, but also a kind of power to obliterate and destroy. After the 11-layer three-dimensional talisman was smashed into tiny three-dimensional talismans, it did not stop there. Instead, it continued to attack the dispersed three-dimensional talismans, causing them to continue to break apart and change. Finally, after they completely dissipated, all the three-dimensional talismans completely turned into the original power that formed them and finally integrated into the void as if they had never existed. Luo Fan's figure appeared where the three-dimensional talisman originally was. He and Wu Daozi met once more after tens of millions of years. How is this possible? The moment he saw Luo Fan, Wu Daozi completely forgot his original plan. His eyes were full of disbelief, and his face was full of disbelief. He could not help but exclaim. Luo Fan looked at Wu Daozi and found that compared to nearly 1,000,000 years ago, Wu Daozi seemed to have made a lot of progress. At this moment, his aura was faintly discernible, but it could be seen that it was much stronger than before. I didn't expect you to be able to make further progress. It seems that you are one step closer to becoming a sage. It is really admirable. Luo Fan smiled faintly. Impossible. How could you become a peak quasi-sage in such a short time? How could this happen? Wu Daozi did not listen to Luo Fan's words at all. He just stared at Luo Fan and said almost hysterically. Chapter 10:29. Nearly 9 million years had passed since Wu Daozi recovered from the abnormality of the last day's palace and sat on the edge of the Qilin cliff to comprehend the mysteries of the 100 million era vortex. After such a long time, the situation on the Qilin cliff was completely different from before. There was a batch of cultivators that came out of the era vortex every few hundred years. By now, the total number had increased to hundreds of thousands. Although this number was insignificant compared to the entire Qilin cliff, it was enough to remove the word barely from the cultivation world that had been formed back then. It had truly become a complete cultivation world. After nearly 9 million years, the central sacred master, who had been punished by Wu Daozi to open up 100 million caves, was still working hard to open up a cave. In fact, for ordinary cultivators, it was extremely easy for them to open up a cave, even if they were not at the peak of the sage-to-be great perfection or even below the intermediate perfection. They could easily open up one in a few breaths. Even if they were particular, it would only take them a few days to successfully open up the cave. However, such an abode was a simple, independent abode. If this kind of cave was placed on the Qilin cliff, how different would it be from the cave that the cultivators had opened up? Why would Wu Daozi need to get the central sacred master to open it up? Obviously, the cave that the central sacred master opened couldn't be like this. It also couldn't be so easy to open it up. Every cave that he opened up needed to be completely integrated with the Qilin cliff. It needed to be built according to the nature of the Qilin cliff and meticulously polished in order to make the cave meet Wu Daozi's requirements. Not only would the cave not affect the power circulation of the Qilin cliff, but it would also promote it. Such a cave naturally couldn't be opened up in a few days or even a few breaths. Even if the central sacred master was a peak of the sage-to-be, it would take him several years to open up such a cave. Under such circumstances, it would take nearly 9 million years. The cave that the central sacred master opened up. There are only slightly more than 1 million caves. Compared to the 100 million caves that Wu Daozi had set, it was only equivalent to about 1%. If he wanted to truly end this punishment, it would probably take more than 800 million years to reach 900 million years. However, although he had only opened up 1 million cave abodes. However, compared to the hundreds of thousands of cultivators on the Qilin cliff, the number of cultivators was much lower. But it was more than enough. At this moment, the hundreds of thousands of cultivators on the Qilin cliff were all living in the cave that the central sacred lord had opened up. They had carved it out themselves. The cave abode, which was incompatible with the Qilin cliff and even affected the flow of energy in the Qilin cliff, had long been erased. The energy flow of the entire Qilin cliff became incomparably smooth. The power that Wu Daozi could mobilize also became stronger, and his control became more flexible. If a living being were to stand at the top of Qilin cliff and look down at the entire Qilin cliff, he would find that the entire Qilin cliff seemed to be one. Everything that existed on it, including the caves, seemed to have existed when Qilin cliff was first born. It was completely integrated with Qilin cliff, and there was nothing unnatural about it. Of course, it was impossible for everyone in the cultivation world, which consisted of hundreds of thousands of people, to do the same thing. Of the hundreds of thousands of cultivators, only a small portion remained in the cave abodes to cultivate. In fact, it didn't even take up half of the total. Most of the other cultivators were either comprehending the Tao in some natural landscape of Qilin cliff, playing with each other, discussing the Tao, or gathering in one place to trade. All sorts of things formed a complete cultivation world. At this moment, Wu Daozi's aura engulfed the entire Qilin cliff. Aside from a few peak quasi-sages, the rest of the hundreds of thousands of cultivators were suppressed by this aura and fainted without any reaction. Naturally, they couldn't continue doing what they were doing. Fortunately, this Qilin cliff was Wu Daozi's Tao field, so there was nothing dangerous here that could threaten these cultivators. As a result, they suddenly fainted and could not control themselves. However, no cultivators were injured or even killed because of this change. Although the peak quasi-sages didn't faint because of the aura, they still felt extremely uncomfortable. Those in the cave abodes were in a better state. They could fuse with the cave abodes to resist the aura. Although they didn't look good, they could still maintain their composure. The peak quasi-sages who were doing something outside the cave abodes were unlucky. They stood there, feeling the terrifying aura that seemed to cover the sky and the earth. For a moment, they couldn't move at all. They could only tremble slightly and break out in cold sweat. They had completely lost their composure. Is this the strength of the sage's disciple? How could he be so powerful? We're both peak quasi-sages. We're in the same realm. How could he make me so flustered just because he didn't target my aura? This thought flashed through the minds of the peak quasi-sages. If Wu Daozi knew what they were thinking, he would definitely scoff at it. Although the peak quasi-sage was a realm, there were many divisions within it. At this time, he had reached the peak of the peak and could even carry out the sage creation plan of the ancestor of all demons. However, these peak quasi-sages had just entered the peak quasi-sage realm. Even if they were to use the common division of realms, they were still separated by 4 small realms: initial, advanced, and peak. With such a gap, wasn't it normal for such a situation to occur? However, at this moment, Wu Daozi was obviously not in the mood to care about them. At this moment, Wu Daozi was wholeheartedly focused on Luo Fan. How could you reach the peak quasi-sage realm without anyone noticing? Why aren't there any signs? Wu Daozi spat out hysterical words, although his aura had enveloped the entire Qilin cliff from afar. However, his target was Luo Fan, who was in front of him. It was Luo Fan, the one who had made him scratch his head and become a peak quasi-sage all of a sudden. If the aura that covered the entire Qilin cliff was 1, then the aura that he used to cover Luo Fan was 10,000. Such a terrifying aura was enough to cause a change in time. At that moment, the space and time around Luo Fan's body had completely changed, becoming like the toughest substance in the world, causing him to tremble with every breath he took. Every time he took a breath, his body trembled. It took a lot of energy to do so. Facing such an aura that was tens of thousands of times stronger than the aura that covered the entire Qilin cliff, Luo Fan's performance was much better than those peak quasi-sages. At this moment, his expression did not change at all. He was still smiling faintly. It looked like the surroundings could change the space-time. The aura that froze the space-time was like a spring breeze. That's all. Luo Fan smiled faintly. At this moment, the aura that Wu Daozi gave off was so powerful, so shocking, and so terrifying. That kind of might that could change space and time, that kind of divine might that could destroy the heavens and the earth, was enough to make any cultivator tremble in fear and be unable to control themselves. However, such an aura was so weak and had so many loopholes for Luo Fan. It was even more so when compared to the aura that he had comprehended for so many years and could even create an endless rune void. Facing such an aura, how could Luo Fan, who had comprehended even more mysterious aura for tens of thousands of years, feel helpless? He knew the weakness of this aura with just one look. With that in mind, a thought flashed through his mind. He raised his hand and gently poked forward. In an instant, the aura that could change the space-time and destroy the world seemed to be made of tofu. At least, the part of the aura around Luo Fan's body seemed to be made of tofu. In an instant, it completely collapsed and disappeared, forming an aura hole. It revealed an aura forbidden zone that spanned dozens of feet around Luo Fan. Wu Daozi felt the change in his aura and could not help but widen his eyes. "What kind of magic is this?" he cried out in surprise. This cry caused the hysterical expression on his face to become even more obvious. However, it also caused his mind to calm down a little. He regained some of his rationality. It was obvious that the previous change reminded him of his comprehension of the last day's palace millions of years ago. At this moment, Luo Fan's understatement was very similar to what he had done in the past. Back then, he had also been casual like this. It was as if nothing had happened, and he had made the last day's palace disappear from his senses. He could only see its shadow and could not sense the truth. "This is not a magic. I just saw through your aura." Luo Fan shook his head and said, "Aura is aura. What is there to see through?" Wu Daozi said disdainfully. To him, aura was aura. Everyone's aura was born with it. Its changes were also natural. Its power was also naturally formed based on the strength of the owner of the aura. He usually only used this kind of aura, but he had never studied it. Of course, he didn't study it. It wasn't because he didn't have enough knowledge to study it, but because he had more things to study. He wanted to learn and comprehend too many things. For him, the comprehension of aura was completely useless to the advancement of his cultivation. Moreover, so what if he studied this aura thoroughly? An aura was just an aura. Even if one studied it thoroughly and knew all of its profundities, so what if one could understand everything? It was naturally not a problem for them to fight each other with their auras. However, if he wanted to use this aura as a means of battle to defeat his enemies, it would be more convenient to use other abilities to deal with his enemies. No matter how strong his aura was, could it be stronger than a saint's magic? If he used a shocking aura, he would not need to block it. With a divine ability thrown over, you would have to embarrassingly surrender and honestly use normal fighting methods to fight. Thus, how could he waste his precious energy on studying this aura? Because of this, Wu Daozi was very disdainful of Luo Fan's words. He thought that Luo Fan was lying to him. Luo Fan did not comment on Wu Daozi's words. He had no obligation to teach Wu Daozi how to use his aura. He had no obligation to tell Wu Daozi that he had improved so much. The reason for this was because of the aura on one of the treasures he controlled. This was a matter between the sage and the ancestor of all demons. Therefore, Luo Fan merely smiled. Since you don't believe what I said, then you can guess it yourself. Wu Daozi looked at Luo Fan's calm expression. Could it be that he really saw through my aura? But how is that possible? Normal people wouldn't look for flaws in one's aura. They would just use their own aura to suppress me. If he really saw through my aura, then there must be something wrong with his brain. He thought to himself. His expression calmed down. Even though his aura was blocked, he did not stop thinking about dealing with Luo Fan. To him, Luo Fan's change was completely out of his expectations. If he did not find out why Luo Fan had such a change, he would not give up. Since aura was useless, then he would not use it to test his opponent. With a slight thought, the aura spread out and covered the entire Qilin Cliff, causing the hundreds of thousands of cultivators on the Qilin Cliff to fall into a coma, and the few peak quasi-sages to resist disappeared in an instant. It was completely withdrawn back into his body as if it had never appeared in the first place. Most of the unconscious cultivators were peak quasi-sages. Only a small portion were intermediate quasi-sages and minor quasi-sages. All of them had extremely precise control over their will. They had fainted because of the sudden, powerful aura and were unable to resist it for a moment. At this moment, the aura that made them faint had disappeared, and they instantly recovered and woke up from that kind of coma. After waking up, they were extremely vigilant. In an instant, they used their magic skills and magic treasures to protect themselves and their spirit. Then, they started to look around to see what power had knocked them unconscious. When they saw their surroundings clearly, they were all terrified. This was because they realized that they were not the only ones who had fainted. Everyone they had seen, felt, and heard had fainted at that moment. To them, such a fact simply subverted their worldview, making them feel as if they had fallen into a dream. As a sage-to-be, even if they weren't great accomplishment sage-to-be, they were definitely not ordinary cultivators or ordinary cultivators. They were all favored by the heavens in their own era. They were definitely terrifying existences that only one in a billion cultivators could produce. It was impossible for such an existence to have no confidence, and it was impossible for him to have a weak will. Their confidence in themselves made them believe that there were people in this world who could defeat them. That was for sure. However, there was absolutely no one who could defeat them easily, and there was absolutely no one who could make them lose consciousness without any resistance in a situation where they could not make a single sound. However, at this moment, such a situation had occurred. All of them had been knocked unconscious by some unimaginable an untraceable power without making a sound. Furthermore, this power had even destroyed their sense of time. When they woke up, they felt as if only a moment had passed. They could not even sense how long they had been unconscious. This change was even more unimaginable than simply knocking them unconscious. It required even more power and might. This meant that the power that had knocked them unconscious had to have stopped all of their power, and everything else in an instant. If there had been any instability, any bit of power, any bit of willpower that had not instantly knocked them unconscious and stopped working, they would not have felt this way and would not have known how long they had been unconscious. After all, cultivators were not ordinary people. For ordinary people, the memories that they could sense were only in their brains. But for cultivators, their everything, their bodies, their power, their perception, their will, their mind, and even the objects around them that were stained with their aura, they could sense the memories contained within. Under such circumstances, ordinary unconsciousness was equivalent to a nap. After waking up, they could still easily sense the memories of the process of unconsciousness from their bodies, their power, and even the objects around them that had been contaminated with their aura. They could even sense how long they had been unconscious. For cultivators with keen senses, they could even see the various things that had happened during the period of unconsciousness and the various changes in the situation. However, none of this existed in the bodies of these cultivators. Chapter 10:30. Such a change clearly meant that the aura they had encountered earlier had penetrated deep into their origin, directly cutting off all the memories they might have. This meant that the gap between them and the owner of that aura was so great that it had reached an inconceivable level. This kind of difference, according to their understanding, could only be found between them and a sage. Could it be that a sage has just descended? This thought appeared uncontrollably in the minds of many cultivators. It became clearer and clearer, making them extremely regretful. They regretted missing out on seeing the true appearance of a sage. They regretted missing out on such a great opportunity. They looked around, trying to find traces of the sage. But where could they find them? On the entire Chelan Cliff. Only the last day's haul had suddenly disappeared. There was only one more cultivator they had never seen before. Moreover, it was an extremely powerful cultivator. At this moment, countless cultivators suddenly had the same thought. Could it be that this new cultivator was the saint? However, they were still rational after all. After all, they were sage-to-be cultivators who had seen a lot of things, so they quickly extinguished this nonsensical thought. If that person was a real sage, they would not have looked at him so calmly. The moment they saw him, they would have condensed a sage imprint in the depths of their souls. This abnormality alone was enough for them to completely overturn the idea that this new cultivator was a sage. Moreover, at this moment, Wu Daozi did not have any intention of obeying the new cultivator. Instead, he was staring at him like a tiger watching its prey, as if he could attack him at any time. This was not the attitude one should have when facing a sage. Plus, this was enough to convince them that this person was not a sage. If this person is not a sage, then who is he? Why did such a terrifying aura appear just now? This doubt appeared in their minds along with the dispelling of that ridiculous thought. At this moment, whether it was Wu Daozi or Luo Fan, they did not have the mind to care about what the other cultivators were thinking. The terrifying aura just now was released by Wu Daozi with all his strength. He did not conceal his aura at all. However, it was not specifically targeted at the many cultivators on the Chelan Cliff. Compared to the aura that Luo Fan encountered, this made the other cultivators suspect that this was the aura of a sage. It was only 1 in 10,000. However, Luo Fan was able to easily break through the aura that was tens of thousands of times stronger than what they had encountered. From this, it could be seen how weak they were in Luo Fan's eyes. How could he divert his attention when he was facing Wu Daozi, who had already decided to go all out? As for Wu Daozi, he only needed to release his aura to subdue all of these cultivators. How could he be distracted because of them? Wu Daozi stood there, facing Luo Fan. After he withdrew his aura, his eyes shone with a faint, mysterious light. This mysterious light was extremely mysterious, and its color was indescribable. Anyone who saw this mysterious light would only feel that it was mysterious, but they wouldn't be able to describe it in detail. He looked at Luo Fan and said softly. He raised his hand and slapped down at Luo Fan. In an instant, the power of the entire Qilin cliff suddenly condensed in Luo Fan's location, condensing into a huge Qilin in the void, surrounded by flames and stepping on auspicious clouds. This Qilin was billions of times more real than the Qilin that the ancestral Taoist had condensed with the power of the Qilin cliff that Wu Daozi had given him. It appeared in the air. In an instant, the space within millions of miles seemed to be under the Qilin's absolute control. Even Luo Fan felt that it was difficult to breathe. It was as if he was being restricted by some kind of terrifying power. After the Qilin formed, it spread its four legs and began to rush towards Luo Fan. It was so fast that it seemed to surpass time and space. The moment it appeared, it was already in front of Luo Fan. It opened its mouth and bit towards Luo Fan. Soon, Luo Fan was already in its mouth. The Qilin's bite contained the power to destroy heaven and earth. Even if the entire earth and universe were placed in its mouth, it would collapse and disappear in an instant. Although Luo Fan's strength was amazing, and he had already reached the Tao Master Realm, he was still far inferior to the earth and universe. It was a bite that could turn the entire earth and the universe into nothingness. If he did not resist, it would be impossible for him to escape to the heavens. In the face of such a bite, Luo Fan's expression did not change. He just lifted his foot and took a step forward. It seemed that his body did not move, but it also seemed that he had traveled through countless space-times in an instant. He appeared directly in front of Wu Daozi. The Qilin's bite directly bit nothing. The space-time was directly smashed in its mouth, and a powerful space-time fluctuation spread out from its mouth in all directions. If it were not for the fact that they were on Qilin Cliff, if the space-time within millions of miles was not completely under the Qilin's absolute control, such a space-time fluctuation was enough to completely turn the space-time within a radius of hundreds of millions of miles into powder and into nothingness. But at this moment, these fluctuations only formed faint ripples in the void. Moreover, in just a breath, they had already disappeared without a trace. The way Luo Fan dodged the Qilin's bite did not use any amazing divine sense, nor did it consume much Dharma power. Instead, his eyes flashed slightly, and he saw through the body structure of the Qilin and all the subtle changes of the Qilin's bite. The structure of the Qilin was exquisite and indescribable. It was enough to make all cultivators worship it wherever it was, and even to set off a bloody storm in order to obtain this structure. But for Luo Fan, the structure of the Aura rune was much worse than the rune that he had been in for nearly 9 million years. The originally incomparably tight structure. In his eyes, it was like a fishing net with holes. If he wanted to, he could poke it gently, and it would completely explode. The Qilin's bite was like a natural divine sense, and contained infinite power. However, in his eyes, it was also extremely crude. There were countless gaps that he could easily pass through. Even if he was just a normal person, he could easily dodge it. Because of these two reasons, he could directly step over the Qilin's obstruction and arrive in front of Wu Daozi. That couldn't be any more normal. Wu Daozi frowned. In his eyes, Luo Fan's step just now was like an antelope hanging its horn, leaving no trace behind. With his perception and knowledge, Luo Fan had no way of escaping. With his perception and knowledge, he had no idea how Luo Fan dodged the Qilin's bite. He also couldn't see what kind of exquisite and indescribable method Luo Fan had used to appear in front of him. What kind of technique is this? Such a thought flashed through his mind. However, his movements did not stop at all. He raised his hand and formed a hand seal. In an instant, a majestic force appeared out of thin air. It directly wrapped around Luo Fan and was about to crush him into pieces. This majestic force seemed to be untraceable. It was as if it was born out of nothingness and appeared around Luo Fan. It was as if it was about to completely wipe away all traces of his existence in the infinite space. This was clearly an extremely terrifying divine sense. It did not seem to produce any strange phenomenon and was far less powerful than the Qilin formed by the Qilin cliff. However, the strength of this divine sense was tens of thousands of times stronger than the Qilin from before. Even at this realm, I still need to form hand seals to use this divine sense. It seems that this divine sense was passed down from the ancestor of all monsters. Luo Fan felt the majestic force, and such a thought flashed through his mind. If this was a divine sense that Wu Daozi had created it himself, then he naturally knew all the principles behind it. To use this divine sense, he naturally did not need any hand seals or even any postures. He only needed to use his mind and strength. Since he had to rely on hand seals to perform such a magical power, it was obvious that this magical power was not created by him. It meant that he did not fully understand the principles of this magical power, and he was only imitating it. Obviously, as a peak quasi-sage, he could not understand this divine sense. If it was not created by himself, then it was most likely passed down from a sage. However, even though he understood this, Luo Fan still did not panic. The fact that he needed hand seals to perform this technique meant that the power of this technique was far beyond the limit of Wu Daozi's cultivation level. However, at the same time, it also meant that his control over this technique had not reached a flawless level. This also meant that in the hands of Wu Daozi, there were many imperfections that should not have existed. After all, he was a peak quasi-sage. With such a high cultivation realm, it was naturally impossible for there to be such big flaws. These imperfections meant that Luo Fan did not need to completely disintegrate this divine sense to be able to dodge. As long as he could find these imperfections, he would be able to escape the threat of this divine sense. After becoming a Dao master, Luo Fan's eyesight and strength were many times stronger than before. At this moment, almost all the secrets of the world were laid out in front of him. Although the power of this divine sense was extremely shocking and there were many mysteries that he could not understand, the imperfections were also extremely clear. He could see through them at a glance. Seeing this, he raised his hand and pointed to the front left. In an instant, 9 three-dimensional talismans rushed out from his finger and quickly formed an extremely complicated combination in the void. In an instant, they formed a palm that seemed to be formed by countless three-dimensional talismans. At first glance, the palm seemed to be composed of countless layers of 3D talismans, and the 3D talismans that formed the palm itself were composed of innumerable 3D talismans, and so on. However, upon a closer look, it seemed to be composed of only 9 3D talismans. Its mysteriousness could not be described with words. After this palm, formed by three-dimensional talismans, appeared, it gently squeezed the void in front of him to the left. In an instant, Wu Daozi's expression changed greatly. That majestic power suddenly went out of control and exploded with a loud bang. This power was terrifying. At this moment, it was vividly displayed. In an instant, the space within a radius of millions of miles was completely shattered. Even the Qilin formed by the power of Qilin Cliff was instantly erased by this majestic power. It did not even have time to turn back into the power of Qilin Cliff. It completely turned into nothingness and disappeared without a trace. At this moment, both of them were standing on the ground of Qilin Cliff. The impact also affected the ground where they stood. The land within a radius of millions of miles collapsed and turned into nothingness, leaving only a deep pit where they stood. The entire Qilin Cliff began to shake violently because of this change. Vaguely, it seemed like it was about to collapse and disappear. At this moment, Wu Daozi could not care about Luo Fan anymore. This Qilin Cliff was his main dojo. If something happened to it, it would be a great loss to him. His cultivation level would not be affected much, but his strength would be reduced by at least 10 times because he would lose the support of Qilin Cliff. One had to know, at Wu Daozi's current cultivation level, how shocking was a difference of 10 times in strength. It was enough to completely remove him from the plan of the all-demons ancestor. This was related to the future of his cultivation and whether or not he could become a sage in the future. Under such circumstances, the various conflicts between him and Luo Fan had become so insignificant. He had already become so insignificant. The majestic power affected a radius of millions of miles. Within this area, there were many cave abodes established by the central sacred master. Each of these cave abodes had become one with Chelan Cliff, and each of them was an extremely exquisite place of cultivation. In the lower realm, each of them would be an excellent place for a large sect to protect. However, at this moment, under the influence of the majestic power, these cave abodes completely disappeared along with the ground of Chelan Cliff. They were completely erased and turned into absolute nothingness. Fortunately, although these cave abodes still existed, because of what happened to the central sacred master millions of years ago, there were no cultivators in these cave abodes. Thus, the silver lining in the misfortune was that none of the cultivators on Chelan Cliff had died along with the disappearance of the caves. Fortunately, the cultivation world above Chelan Cliff remained unscathed. However, although their lives were not in danger. However, the hundreds of thousands of greater mastery, intermediate mastery, minor mastery, and peak mastery quasi-sages were all shaken and could not control themselves. What was happening in front of them was simply a subversion of their worldview. It made them feel that the time they knew in the past was as fake as a pile of dog, sh*t. They had experienced how mysterious, sturdy, and indestructible the Chelan Cliff was over the past millions of years. However, at this moment, the exchange of moves between Luo Fan and Wu Dao Zi, which did not seem to cause much of a phenomenon, actually created such a huge hole in the Chelan Cliff. Moreover, the entire Chelan Cliff was shaking as if it could collapse at any time. This told them that the impact of their battle was not limited to what they could see. If there were no other abnormalities, the entire Chelan Cliff would probably collapse. After realizing this, some sharp-witted cultivators suddenly felt inexplicably pleasantly surprised. If the Chelan Cliff completely collapses, won't we be free? Won't we be confined to this small Taoist, right ground, and be able to roam freely in the world? Many cultivators had a strange expression on their faces. As sage-to-be cultivators, they were all favored by the heavens in their respective eras. Naturally, they had their own pride. The Chelan Cliff seemed to be free and unfettered, and the cultivation environment was excellent. However, it did not change the fact that they were confined and their freedom was restricted. Naturally, not all of them would agree to such a situation. For a moment, the atmosphere of the cultivation world on the Chelan Cliff became somewhat strange. Wu Dao Zi could not even care about Luo Fan, let alone the hundreds of thousands of cultivators. His eyes were filled with anxiety as he turned around and disappeared without a trace. For other cultivators, the process of him disappearing was untraceable and difficult to find. However, for Luo Fan, Wu Daozi's movements were extremely clear. He saw all the changes, and if he wanted to, he could easily stop Wu Daozi's movements and prevent him from disappearing. However, Luo Fan did not do so. After all, Wu Daozi was backed by a sage, the ancestor of all demons. If he pushed Wu Daozi too far and created irreconcilable hatred, then it would not be a good thing for Wu Daozi. Therefore, he only calmly watched Wu Daozi's changes with a faint smile. He did not do anything else. After Wu Daozi disappeared, the entire Chelan Cliff seemed to be suppressed by some kind of terrifying power and quickly calmed down. After a long time, the feeling of collapse finally disappeared and the entire Chelan Cliff stopped shaking. In fact, even the terrifying deep hole that was created by the boundless power was gradually recovering. During this process, it was like the wounds of a living being were rapidly healing. The walls of the hole began to produce countless granular-like rocks that wriggled and connected. In the end, the hole continued to shrink. After 3 days, the changes finally stopped and the hole completely disappeared. It really is a good method. Looking at such a change, Luo Fan could not help but secretly praise. Chapter 10:31. Although 3 days had passed, many cultivators on the Chelan Cliff were still immersed in what had happened 3 days ago. Those who had hoped for the collapse of the Chelan Cliff were disappointed, while those who had been shocked by the terrifying momentum of the battle were looking forward to it. The moment the big hole in the Chelan Cliff was restored, the entire Chelan Cliff shook slightly. This kind of shaking was different from the one 3 days ago, when the huge hole in the Chelan Cliff was broken by that force. Instead, it was the kind of shaking that occurred when a creature woke up from its sleep. It was the kind of shaking that was full of vitality and infinite vitality. The appearance of this kind of shaking did not represent destruction, but creation. After the shaking appeared, the hundreds of thousands of cultivators on the Chelan Cliff instantly felt an inexplicable sense of security. It was as if the place where they stood suddenly had an indescribable power that could protect them and resist all attacks from the outside world. This feeling made those cultivators who had been disappointed hide their disappointment in the depths of their hearts, and those who had been looking forward to it felt inexplicably excited. Because as sage-to-be cultivators, this kind of feeling was not limited to the surface. It was just limited to this feeling of security. They could see through this feeling and clearly see the hidden meaning behind it. The feeling of security naturally indicated that the Chelan Cliff below was far more powerful than them. If the Chelan Cliff had a power that was far more powerful than them, it meant that if the Chelan Cliff had the slightest evil intention, they would absolutely not be able to escape and would definitely be completely wiped out by the Chelan Cliff. Otherwise, how could the Chelan Cliff give them such a feeling? For the past 3 days, Luo Fan had been hovering above the void, quietly standing. When he felt the appearance of a shaking, he could not help but smile. It seems that you still don't want to stop. Then let me see your divine sense. Such a thought flashed through his mind. At this moment, his heart was filled with endless confidence. His current cultivation realm was only at the Dao Master realm, and could only be regarded as a beginner Dao Master. He was at the peak of the Sage-to-Be peak, where Wu Daozi was at. He still needed to reach the initial realm, the profound realm, and the exceptional realm. However, he did not feel that Wu Daozi was much stronger than him. Even though he was not a match for Wu Daozi in terms of pure strength, in terms of the use of strength, in terms of fighting methods, he was confident enough to look down on Wu Daozi. As a result, even though Wu Daozi was at the pinnacle of quasi-sages and was stronger than him by a few small realms, Mo Wuji was not afraid. He was also confident enough to suppress him. At this moment, a figure suddenly appeared in front of Luo Fan. This figure was Wu Daozi. However, Wu Daozi did not seem to have changed much on the surface compared to 3 days ago. But Luo Fan could tell with a glance that he was much weaker compared to 3 days ago. It was obvious that he had consumed a lot of energy in these 3 days. Wu Daozi looked at Luo Fan with an extremely cold expression. It was as if he was looking at a dead person. He stared at Luo Fan and said, "I didn't think that you would almost destroy the training ground. It seems like even though you are a hindrance to my master's plan, I cannot let you live." When Luo Fan heard this, he couldn't help but laugh. "I don't think it is an honor for you to let me live because of the ancestor of all monsters' plan. Therefore, to me, your words are just nonsense. If you want to fight, then fight. If you don't, then leave. Why talk so much? It seems like becoming a peak of the Sage-to-Be has inflated your confidence. These 3 days were originally a great chance for you to escape. I didn't think that you would be this stupid," Wu Daozi said calmly. As he spoke, he shook his head as if he was feeling sorry for Luo Fan's stupidity. Hee, even though this world is boundless, to cultivators like me, it is so small. If I want to hide from you, there are too many things that I need to do, and it is too troublesome. In comparison, it is more convenient to beat you into submission," Luo Fan said with a faint smile. These words finally made Wu Daozi's expression turn even uglier. These words were simply a humiliation to him. Even though this world was not that big to a peak of the Sage-to-Be, it was not difficult to find a specific person or item in this world. Even if a normal cultivator hid at the ends of the earth, they would not be able to hide from the detection of a peak of the sage-to-be. However, that was only for normal cultivators. For a peak of the sage-to-be, it was not too troublesome to hide from the detection of another peak of the sage-to-be. At least, Wu Daozi could easily think of 70 to 80 ways to open up a void, set up a formation, or completely change one's aura. In other words, the trouble that Luo Fan mentioned about wanting to avoid his detection was just a matter of casually thinking about it and making some preparations. That's all. This kind of trouble was nothing to him. However, Luo Fan said that this trouble was more important than dealing with him. Wasn't this implying that it was easier to deal with him than to deal with those troubles? Wasn't this a great humiliation to him? At this moment, Wu Daozi's expression was extremely ugly. He sneered and said, "I originally didn't want to use this treasure. It seems like it is not up to me now." With that, he waved his hand, and a bronze ruler appeared in his hand. This bronze ruler looked very ordinary. It didn't have any special aura, nor did it exude any special power. It looked like an ordinary bronze ruler from the mortal world. Seeing this bronze ruler, Luo Fan's complexion could not help but change slightly. Back then, Wu Daozi used this ordinary-looking ruler to fight against Ashimuzi. The scene of that fight was still vivid in Luo Fan's mind, even after 9 million years. At this moment, when he found that he was about to face such a terrifying bronze ruler, even he had to become serious. Wu Daozi did not have any intention of talking to Luo Fan. He raised the bronze ruler and gently swung it towards Luo Fan's head. The entire process did not create any strange phenomena. Not to mention the change in time and space, even the surrounding energy did not move at all. It seemed like this ruler was still so ordinary, like something from the mortal world. However, at this moment, Luo Fan felt an indescribable sense of danger. This sense of danger, it was an extreme danger to his life. It was a sense that he could die at any moment and his soul would scatter. This sense of crisis made Luo Fan instantly realize that if he was hit by this bronze ruler, he would definitely die. What awaited him would be the destruction of his soul. There would be no second possibility. Seeing this, he did not dare to be careless. He did not dare to be careless. With a soft roar, his body trembled. In an instant, his figure streaked across the void in a mysterious trajectory, dodging the bronze ruler with unimaginable martial arts attainments. However, the development of the situation did not go as Luo Fan had expected. The strike of the bronze ruler did not contain any martial arts principles. The entire process was like a naughty child using the ruler to hit someone. It seemed so unreasonable and clumsy. However, no matter where Luo Fan dodged, no matter how mysterious, and inconceivable his trajectory in the air was, he could not avoid that ruler. The ruler was still swinging toward him at a steady pace, and the distance between it and his head was still shrinking at the same speed as it was at the beginning. Luo Fan's eyes flashed with a dazzling light. Flashes of wisdom flowed through his mind. Wu Daozi's actions were done on purpose and did not contain any martial arts principles. At this moment, no matter how he dodged, he could not avoid the bronze ruler. This was clearly not Wu Daozi's method, but the bronze ruler's own function, its own profoundness. Just based on this point, Luo Fan clearly felt how mysterious the bronze ruler before him was. It is actually this powerful. Looks like I have underestimated it before. As Luo Fan thought so, he finally realized that he couldn't dodge anymore. So he suddenly raised his hand, and as the magic power in his body circulated, countless three-dimensional talismans rushed out from his hand, condensing into a huge shield in front of him. Then he faced the bronze ruler head-on. Although the power of this bronze ruler was incomparably terrifying, and it was even enough to turn everything in the world into a strange state similar to primal chaos, this was not a reason for Luo Fan to give up. Even if it seemed that he could not dodge at this moment, he must do everything in his power to resist this ruler. The shield formed by three-dimensional glyphs was extremely mysterious. There were hundreds of thousands of three-dimensional glyphs that formed the shield, but the shield that they formed seemed to be formed by countless layers of three-dimensional glyphs. At first glance, the shield only seemed to be formed by a layer of three-dimensional glyphs. However, upon closer inspection, the three-dimensional glyphs that formed the shield were formed by countless three-dimensional glyphs. As the glyphs continued to penetrate deeper, it seemed to reach an infinite level. This was already the method that Luo Fan had used all the mysteries of the rune structure that he had comprehended from the rune structure of the aura. At this moment, although the shield could not be said to be as mysterious as the rune structure of the aura, and even the order of the rune layers could form an article about the way of the sage, it was by no means simple. Every layer of three-dimensional glyphs was equivalent to a layer of three-dimensional talisman void. Countless layers of three-dimensional glyphs were equivalent to countless layers of three-dimensional talisman void. If one wanted to break the shield, it was equivalent to breaking the countless layers of three-dimensional talisman void in an instant. From this, it could be seen how amazing the defensive power of the shield was. Although there were only hundreds of thousands of three-dimensional glyphs that formed the shield, which did not seem to be much, the complexity of its construction was too amazing. Therefore, even though Luo Fan was already in the Town Master realm, he still turned pale and breathed heavily when he completed such a complicated project in an instant. After all, he had not fully comprehended all the mysteries of the rune structure of the aura. It was still too difficult for him to create such a nearly infinite layer of three-dimensional glyphs. When Wu Daozi saw that Luo Fan was unable to dodge, he actually used his power to condense such a shield. He sneered, obviously feeling disdain for Luo Fan's overconfidence. My magic weapon has already surpassed the Sage-to-Be level. Only a magic weapon of the same level can possibly resist it. You want to block my magic treasure with this kind of power? You're simply courting death. As he thought so, he was too lazy to change his action. He directly continued to hit the shield with the bronze ruler. Luo Fan wanted to use the shield to block the bronze ruler, and Wu Daozi also wanted to use the bronze ruler to destroy all of Luo Fan's hopes. Under such circumstances, things naturally developed very smoothly. In an instant, the bronze ruler directly hit the countless layers of three-dimensional glyphs on the shield. There was no sound at all. At that moment, Luo Fan felt an indescribably terrifying power acting on his body through the shield. His body, his internal organs, his strength, his divine soul, his will, his perception, his mind and thoughts, everything about him. At this moment, they all suffered an indescribable shock. Faintly, there was already no place that was not injured. As for the shield, it did not know how many layers were broken in an instant. The three-dimensional glyphs on the shield were like pieces of paper. The bronze ruler broke through layer after layer. In the blink of an eye, the bronze ruler had penetrated deep into the shield. At first glance, it looked like the shield was continuously swallowing the bronze ruler. Wu Daozi's face revealed a look of shock. How is this possible? A shield made of such power is not even a magic weapon. How can it block my magic weapon? At this moment, although the bronze ruler was still continuously breaking through the shield, it still continued to break through layer after layer of the shield. It seemed like this collision had not ended yet. However, Wu Daozi was extremely confident in this bronze ruler. He believed that once this bronze ruler appeared, unless it was a magic treasure of the same level that could slightly block it, all other cultivators would not be able to resist it. The situation in front of him was unprecedented. It could already be said that the bronze ruler had been blocked. After such a thought flashed through his mind, his killing intent towards Luo Fan became even more exuberant. This kind of person must not be allowed to live. He has just reached the peak of the Sage-to-Be level, yet he is already so powerful. In the future, when he reaches my level, won't I be unable to do anything to him even with this treasure? Then, doesn't Master's plan have to be based on him? Absolutely not. With this thought, he raised his hand and shook the bronze ruler slightly. With this tremble, the speed at which the bronze ruler broke through the layers of the three-dimensional talisman void became faster and faster. Previously, It could only break through one layer of the three-dimensional talisman void, but now it could continuously break through 10 layers of the three-dimensional talisman void. This brought even more damage to Luo Fan. The glyphs that formed the shield were completely condensed by Luo Fan. The reason why the shield was formed was completely under the control of Luo Fan's will. Now that the structure of the shield was damaged, the impact was naturally transmitted to his body. While the bronze ruler was constantly vibrating, Luo Fan felt as if there was something hard and long that was inserted into his head, constantly stirring it. This feeling, along with the terrifying pressure that was transmitted into his body through the shield, made Luo Fan feel like he had fallen into a state where he could not decide between life and death. The pain was unbearable. Even so, a smile gradually appeared on Luo Fan's face. I finally blocked it. As he thought about this, he raised his head to look at Wu Daozi. As expected, just as he thought, Wu Daozi's expression was not very good. It should be known that at this moment, Wu Daozi had the absolute upper hand and was completely suppressing him. Under such circumstances, he actually had such an expression on his face. This was enough to see the significance of Luo Fan's block. After this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, he raised his hand and made a grabbing motion in the direction of Wu Daozi. Although his body was injured because of the previous collision, he was still in the Dao Master realm. Even though he was injured, he could still gather his strength. In an instant, countless glyphs condensed in his hand and turned into a palm made of hundreds of thousands of glyphs. It grabbed at Wu Daozi. Wu Daozi's expression changed even more. At this moment, it was too late to pull out the bronze ruler, so he raised his free hand and slapped at the palm. Wu Daozi was at the peak of the sage-to-be. With this slap, the power in his body surged, and in an instant, a strange creature was constructed in the void according to some mysterious method. It went straight for the palm, made of glyphs that Luo Fan had slapped. This strange creature was extremely mysterious. It looked like whatever one thought in one's heart. If one thought of a dragon, it would be a dragon. If one thought of a tiger, it would look like a tiger. If one thought of a qilin, it would be a qilin. In the process of the creature pouncing at the palm, it kept jumping in the void. Every time it jumped, it seemed to be accumulating power, increasing its power to an unimaginable level. The speed at which this creature pounced was extremely fast. When it had jumped hundreds of thousands of times in the void, the three-dimensional talisman palm that Luo Fan had shot out finally collided with the creature. In an instant, it was like the sky was falling and the earth was cracking. Chapter 1032. The tremors were so strong that all the cultivators on the Qilin Cliff felt like they could not stand still. They felt like they were shaking along with time and space. For a time, all sorts of fear, horror, and shock appeared in the minds of these hundreds of thousands of cultivators, causing them to completely suppress all thoughts of resistance they had before. For a time, they had a deeper understanding of how terrifying Wu Daozi and Luo Fan were, and from then on, they didn't dare to compare themselves to the two of them. The scene after Luo Fan's talisman palm collided with the strange beast was that the void shattered and time became chaotic. With the point of impact as the center, the void within a radius of a few hundred miles turned into a strange scene. At first glance, everything seemed normal. However, if one looked closely, they would find that the scene was overlapping with each other. It was as if countless scenes of time were overlapping with each other. As for the space within, it was completely shattered. However, due to some inconceivable reason, it gathered together and maintained its original appearance. It looked no different from normal space. The talisman palm that Luo Fan condensed was similar to the shield that he condensed. On the other hand, the shield formed by countless layers of talismans could withstand the attack of Wu Daozi's magic treasure that surpassed the peak of quasi-sage level. In comparison, the power of the strange beast that Wu Daozi sent out was countless times weaker than the bronze ruler. As such, the result of this collision was very obvious. In an instant, the strange space within a 100-mile radius around Luo Fan and Wu Daozi collapsed with a loud bang, revealing a dark scene that seemed like nothingness. Then, Wu Daozi's entire body was like a cannonball. He flew out from the darkness and smashed into the ground not far away. This collision, it caused the entire Qilin cliff to shake violently. A human-shaped, bottomless pit instantly appeared at the place where the collision occurred. It was the force of the collision that crushed the strange beast. Then, it went past the beast and landed on Wu Daozi's body, causing him to fly backward. As for Wu Daozi, he was sent flying. The bronze ruler in his hand was shattered into pieces. Naturally, as he flew back, he could no longer continue to attack the shield that Luo Fan condensed. This allowed Luo Fan to win this exchange. Luo Fan floated in the void, and the aura around his body shook. In an instant, the void changed. That void completely disappeared and transformed back into normal space-time. It didn't look any different from before. It was as if nothing had happened. At this moment, the hundreds of thousands of cultivators on the Qilin cliff looked at Luo Fan. It was like a normal person looking at a monster. It was a look of disbelief. It was a look that overturned one's worldview. To these cultivators, they submitted to Wu Daozi because Wu Daozi was a disciple of a sage. His power was something they couldn't defend against even if they worked together. Thus, they naturally felt that on the Qilin cliff, Wu Daozi was invincible. Wu Daozi was invincible, and there was absolutely no cultivator who could defeat him. Yet at this moment, the development of reality completely flipped their way of thinking. Wu Daozi, while fighting head-on, was knocked out by a foreign cultivator. He fell deep into the Qilin cliff, and no one knew if he was dead or alive. How could they accept this calmly? How could they not look at Luo Fan with this gaze? However, though they looked at Luo Fan with this gaze, they didn't dare to leave. The terrifying battle between Luo Fan and Wu Daozi had completely dispelled their thoughts of resisting. It made them realize that before Luo Fan and Wu Daozi, they were merely ants. There was no way they could win against them. What Luo Fan could do, they couldn't do. If they had any thoughts of escaping at this time, what awaited them would be becoming Wu Daozi's punching bag. The example of the central holy master was still in front of them. I didn't expect you to grow so much in just a few million years. This is really admirable. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly heard a faint voice coming from the void. He was very familiar with this voice. It was the voice he had heard millions of years ago. It was Song Zi's voice. Song Zi, I haven't seen you for millions of years. You're still as good as ever. Congratulations. When Luo Fan heard this voice, he turned his gaze to a spot in the void and smiled faintly. That place looked very normal, and there was no strange thing at all. But with Luo Fan's extraordinary vision after becoming a Dao Master, he could see that there was a strange space-time hidden in that place. Song Zi was in that space-time. Hey, I have created this hiding method for countless years, but you can actually find it. It seems that you're stronger than I thought. In terms of perception, you can be ranked in the top 10 among the peers I have met for countless years. Song Zi's figure gradually walked out of that space-time and appeared in the void that Luo Fan was looking at. During the whole process, there was no abnormal fluctuation or any change in space-time. It was so natural that it was beyond imagination. It was as if he had been standing there all along. You flatter me, fellow Taoist. I was only able to discover fellow Taoist traces because I had seen fellow Taoist before and knew of fellow Taoist's aura. Being able to sense auras is already very amazing. Ashen Muzi clicked his tongue in admiration. At this moment, Song Zi was the same as he was millions of years ago. He still had the same sage-like temperament and an indescribable temperament. He stood there and smiled, as if the whole world was smiling at him. However, although fellow Taoist has become much stronger, isn't it a little inappropriate to ruin the saint's plan like this? Ashen Muzi changed the topic and said with a slight smile, "Why do you say that? Well, have I ever ruined the saint's plan?" Luo Fan smiled. Song Zi chuckled. Wu Daozi is the person appointed by the saint to carry out the mission. If you kill him, aren't you destroying the saint's plan? No. Luo Fan said disapprovingly. My little magical power is nothing in the eyes of the disciples of the sage. How could fellow Taoist Wu Daozi die because of such a small technique? You must be joking. Just at this moment, there was a soft pu sound. On the Chelan cliff, the human-shaped hole suddenly shook, and a figure appeared in the void above the human-shaped hole. This person held a bronze ruler. There was no dust on his body, and his aura was hidden. He floated in the void without a trace of embarrassment. It was Wu Daozi. At this moment, Wu Daozi's expression seemed calm, but there was anger hidden in his eyes. This anger wasn't just directed at Luo Fan, but also at Songmu Zi. So that's how it is. It looks like I misunderstood, fellow cultivator. Master Ashenwood looked at Wu Daozi's expression and acted like he was enlightened. Songmu Zi, you better stop talking nonsense. If you want, then attack with me. Attack together with me. If you don't want it, then stay at the side. Wu Daozi said coldly. Ha! Dao friend Wu Daozi. Why are you so impatient and angry? This matter needs to be discussed at length. I see that there is only a small misunderstanding between you and Luo Fan. Just explain it and you can clear it up. There is no need to fight and destroy the harmony between the two of you. Songmu Zi smiled. Songmu Zi, you have to think carefully. This matter is not a small matter. This is not a small matter. Wu Daozi frowned and said to Master Ashenwood. Hearing this, Songmu Zi laughed and didn't say anything. Luo Fan looked at the two of them and shook his head. Although Songmu Zi's every word seemed to be mocking Wu Daozi, his true intention was to help Wu Daozi. His mockery towards Wu Daozi was like mockery between bad friends. He was just taking advantage of him verbally, but his heart was on his side. But so what? Perhaps he couldn't beat Wu Daozi or Songmu Zi right now. But if he wanted to protect himself and leave, the two of them couldn't stop him. If that was the case, then why should he be afraid of them? So what if they attack together? How lively. I didn't think I would encounter such a lively event after not coming out for a long time. I'm so lucky. Just at this moment, a deep voice suddenly arose and entered the ears of Luo Fan and Wu Daozi. When the three of them heard this voice, their expressions changed. Luo Fan's complexion slightly changed because he felt the strong fighting intent contained in this voice. This battle intent had almost solidified. Just hearing this voice would make one's blood boil and make them want to fight against the heavens. Wu Daozi and Songmu Zi, on the other hand, recognized the owner of this voice. They seemed to know how troublesome this person was and felt a headache. There was a soft swoosh. From far away, a ray of golden light rushed over and landed next to Wu Daozi and Songmu Zi. It condensed into a human silhouette. This was a dark and skinny youth. He was at most 6 meters tall and looked like he could be blown away by the wind. However, at this moment, the youth's eyes were flashing with absolute battle intent. His body was tall and straight as he stood in the middle of the field. He was like a towering mountain, causing people to unknowingly forget about his height and his small stature. Luo Fan glanced at this person and knew that he was at the peak of the quasi-sage realm. His cultivation level was the same as Wu Daozi and Songmu Zi. Battle Madman, weren't you trapped in the eye of the East Sea and unable to come out? Why are you here now? Wu Daozi was the master of Chelan Cliff after all. He frowned when he saw this person. Ha ha! I was trapped in the eye of the sea for 10 million years by Master. That period just expired a few days ago. I didn't expect to see you two fighting as soon as I came out. I'm really lucky. Enough with the nonsense. What are you waiting for? Let's fight. The skinny youth spoke with the same deep voice that Luo Fan had just heard. What fight? We've already finished sparring. You should go back to where you came from. Wu Daozi frowned. You don't even know how to lie. I can clearly feel the battle intent and hostility between you two. If these two don't disappear, how can this fight end? Sparring? Who are you trying to fool? Battle Madman said disdainfully. Luo Fan looked at Do Guangzi, then looked at Wu Daozi and Master Ashen Mu, who were avoiding him. He couldn't help but feel curious. He didn't know what was so special about Do Guangzi that made the two of them so afraid. Where's the battle intent and hostility? Feel it again. Where's the battle intent and hostility? Master Ashen Mu chuckled. Battle Madman twitched his nose. He seemed to be smelling something. After a while, he said, "The entire sky is filled with your rottenwood smell. It seems like your technique has improved again." Ha! Ashen Musi chuckled and didn't say anything else. "Okay, there is no battle intent and hostility now. You should go to other places with battle intent and hostility. We still have things to do, so we won't entertain you." Wu Daozi said faintly. "That's not up to you." Battle Madman glanced at Wu Daozi. He then looked at Luo Fan and said, "What is your name?" "Luo Fan." Luo Fan smiled. "Luo Fan, a good name." Battle Madman's eyes brightened. Nodding his head, he said. Then, he changed the topic. "How was your battle just now? Who won and who lost?" "Just now, I only fought with fellow Daoist Wu Daozi. The winner hasn't been decided yet." Luo Fan didn't hide anything. "The winner hasn't been decided yet? So if Tsang Mu Zi joins in, you have a higher chance of losing?" Battle Madman laughed. Luo Fan didn't know why he said that, though he was confident that even if Tsang Mu Zi joined in, his life wouldn't be in danger. The possibility of losing was higher. Therefore, he nodded and agreed with Battle Madman. Just then, Wu Daozi and Tsang Mu Zi's expressions changed. The energy inside their bodies moved as if they were brewing something. Right at this moment, Do Quanzi laughed loudly and said, "Good. If that's the case, then I'll join your side. This way, both sides will be more balanced, and the battle will be more satisfying." As he spoke, he waved his hand and a rod appeared in his hand. After that, he held the rod in his hand and smashed it towards Wu Daozi. The posture of this strike contained the mysteries of endless martial arts. Thousands of staff shadows appeared in the void, but these thousands of staff shadows were completely integrated into the long staff. It looked like the countless long staff shadows were completely grasped and integrated into the long staff. It seemed like the long staff's power was increased countless times. Wherever the rod passed, a thin layer of space-time was broken around the rod. The layer of shattered space-time was like a thin film that wrapped around the long staff. It looked as if the countless long staff shadows were dyed with a layer of light. The space-time outside the thin layer of shattered space-time was not affected at all. It still looked the same as usual, as if nothing had changed. Wu Daozi's expression changed. "Do Quangzi, do you want to ruin my master's plan?" As he spoke, he used his bronze ruler to block Battle Madman's rod. Battle Madman laughed. "How can the Saint's plan be so easily ruined? Perhaps my current actions are part of the Saint's plan. Don't say anything, let's fight. Ha ha." As he spoke, his rod trembled in the void. The trajectory it passed through became more and more mysterious, exquisite, and complicated. The bronze ruler in Wu Daozi's hand possessed unparalleled power. Even if Wu Daozi were to casually strike with it, he would be able to hit any target. However, at that very moment, he had no choice but to merge all of his understanding of battle into the bronze ruler. He swung the ruler through the air in mysterious trajectories. Only then did he barely manage to block the long rod that was about to hit his head. This collision was almost soundless. Only the thin film of broken space-time covering the surface of the staff changed subtly, as if it had been broken into more pieces and thickened. There were no changes to the bronze ruler, but Wu Daozi, who was holding the bronze ruler, trembled violently, as if he had been attacked by a powerful force. "Good!" Battle Madman roared, the battle intent in his eyes surging. "I'm at a disadvantage, so you're helping me?" All sorts of thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind. In the end, he understood why Wu Daozi and Ashen Mu Zi were so vigilant and had such a headache when they saw Battle Madman. Looks like this person is simply a battle maniac. As long as he feels good, he won't be able to tell right from wrong. He doesn't care about friend or foe. Although he thought this, he had an interested smile on his face. Wu Daozi was not interested like Luo Fan at all. Instead, he was helpless and angry. He kept saying all sorts of reasons for Madman Do to stop. However, Madman Do didn't care. He just laughed and kept attacking Wu Daozi. Wu Daozi could only helplessly fight with him. Wu Daozi didn't know what to do. Ashen Mu Zi smiled bitterly. He watched the battle between Wu Daozi and Battle Madman with a knowing look in his eyes. Clearly, this wasn't the first time Battle Madman had done this. Luo Fan obviously wouldn't miss such a good opportunity. Even if Wu Dao Zi and Ashen Mu Zi worked together against him, he was confident that he wouldn't die. However, if he wanted to defeat them, it would be extremely difficult. It could even be said to be impossible. Chapter 1033. The battle between Luo Fan and Wu Dao Zi was mainly to show that he had absolute strength and could regain his freedom. It was to show that any peak sage to be, even if it was a disciple of sage, would have to pay an unimaginable price to deal with him. This was enough to make them feel that it was not worth it. This was the purpose of his battle. As for escaping and leaving the Chilling Cliff, it was not difficult for Luo Fan. However, once he escaped and left the Chilling Cliff, what awaited him was Wu Dao Zi's endless attacks and endless troubles. Only by defeating Wu Dao Zi and making him think that he could not deal with him could he gain true freedom after leaving the Chilling Cliff and not be attacked by him. It seemed that what Luo Fan needed now was a fair environment to fight against peak sage-to-be disciples of a sage. If Wu Dao Zi and Ashen Mu Zi attacked together, it would be difficult for him to win. If he fought against both of them at the same time, what awaited Luo Fan was to be suppressed. That would not achieve the effect he wanted. Therefore, for Luo Fan, the fact that Do Guangzi was holding Wu Dao Zi up was a great opportunity for Luo Fan. He could not let go of this opportunity. With these thoughts flashing through his mind, Luo Fan smiled and took a step forward. In an instant, his figure passed through the endless void and arrived in front of Ashen Mu Zi. He raised his hand and pressed it against Ashen Mu Zi's head. After the delay of the previous conversation, Luo Fan's physical state and strength had already recovered to its peak. He had completely recovered. For a Dao master, even if his body was completely destroyed, he could recover in an instant. Moreover, Luo Fan's body was only injured and not completely destroyed. As Luo Fan pressed his hand, countless three-dimensional talismans rushed out of his injured acupoints. In an instant, they condensed into a mysterious light in his hand. With a shocking destructive power, it directly pounced towards Ashen Mu Zi's head. This power was very mysterious, and the space-time fluctuation it caused was extremely weak. However, it was not like the moves of ordinary cultivators, which could not cause space-time fluctuations. Instead, it was because of his understanding of the previous battle. He had already comprehended many ways to completely suppress and eliminate the destructive power of space-time. In fact, what he emitted was the radiance formed by three-dimensional talismans. If it truly erupted, it was enough to completely pulverize space and time within a radius of several million kilometers. Sensing the arrival of this light, Master Tsang Muzi's expression changed slightly. He raised a finger and a giant tree appeared out of thin air. It directly blocked the light. This huge piece of wood was extremely large, but it was very strange. It was directly compressed between Master Ashenwood and Luo Fan's palms, easily blocking the light emitted by Luo Fan's palms. In that instant, the giant tree suddenly began to shake unbelievably. As it trembled, countless wood shavings shot out in all directions. It looked as if the giant wood was made of countless wood shavings. Under the impact, the wood shavings that made up the giant wood could no longer gather together, and countless wood shavings began to leave the body of the giant wood. Seeing this, Master Tsang Muzi was shocked. He had never thought that Luo Fan, a cultivator who had just reached the pinnacle of the sage-to-be realm, could be so powerful. Although the magic he used was not the magic passed down by his master, it was a powerful magic that he had comprehended based on countless years of Tao enlightenment. Its destructive and defensive power was strong enough to destroy heaven and earth, and it could even withstand the destructive power of heaven and earth. However, at this moment, the light emitted from Luo Fan's palms was already enough to make the giant wood almost unable to withstand it. It looked as if it was about to completely collapse. This destructive power completely subverted his understanding of cultivation, causing his expression to change greatly. However, Master Tsang Muzi was a disciple of a sage after all, and he was in existence at the pinnacle of the sage-to-be realm. Seeing this, his body trembled, and he raised a finger. In an instant, countless thunderbolts in the void condensed into an ancient tree. It waved its branches and pounced towards Luo Fan, completely enveloping Luo Fan. The ancient tree formed by thunderbolts was so powerful that even the heavens, earth, and space-time seemed to tremble slightly. An aura of judgment was constantly being emitted from the ancient tree, filling up a radius of a few million miles. Even a void seemed to be trembling along with the brandishing of the branches of the thunderbolt ancient tree. Luo Fan's reaction was incomparably fast. His figure flashed and streaked across the void, dodging the brandishing branches one after another in the nick of time. However, his palm did not waver during this process, and continued to move towards Master Tsang Muzi. The giant wood that blocked the palm continued to collapse in the process, sending sawdust flying in all directions. However, Master Tsang Muzi was obviously not going to stay there and do nothing. His eyes flickered with a dark green light, and in a flash, he disappeared without a trace. It seemed as if he had re-entered the strange space-time that he had opened up. Luo Fan did not care about this at all. He had already seen where the space-time was, and with a thought, he raised his hand. The light formed by the three-dimensional talismans in his hand suddenly trembled violently. As it trembled, the giant would directly collapsed and disappeared into nothingness. Then, he formed a strange hand seal with both hands. In an instant, countless three-dimensional talismans condensed into a bright red river in the void. It suddenly turned and rushed into the strange space-time that Master Tsang Muzi had opened up. As it entered, Master Tsang Muzi's angry snort came from the strange space-time. Then, the entire space-time collapsed, and Master Tsang Muzi's figure directly appeared before Luo Fan. However, at this moment, he was holding a branch that looked like a pole. This was the magic treasure he had used to fight Wu Dao Zi's bronze ruler. Before this magic treasure was a bright red river that circled around like a dragon. It seemed to be looking for an opening to pounce and completely destroy Master Tsang Muzi. Master Tsang Muzi calmly said, "Although this space-time is ordinary, it is a concealment method that I spent millions of years to create. If you destroy it, you will have to pay the price." With that, he attacked with the magic treasure in his hand. In an instant, the void trembled. The bright red river was like a ribbon, twisting and turning as it was struck, unable to maintain a stable state. This bright red river was none other than the river of time that Luo Fan had created on the path of transcendence. It was a divine ability that allowed him to bring out all the profound mysteries of the tide of time to its greatest extent, back when he was still cultivating the Tao of power that Tao Venerate Great Strength had inherited. This magic ability was a combination of many different powers. But at this moment, this magic ability was no longer a combination of powers. However, it was no longer a combination of forces, but countless three-dimensional talismans. When Luo Fan cultivated the way of power, he naturally used the combination of power in order to best display the power of the mysterious trend of the times. But at this moment, he had already cultivated the Tao fruit path created by the worldview of laws. It could bring out the best of its power. Naturally, it was composed of three-dimensional talismans. Moreover, Luo Fan's current cultivation realm was much higher than when he was on the transcendence path. It was already tens of thousands of times more profound. Under such circumstances, the power of the Time River was still tens of thousands of times stronger. Under such circumstances, the power of the Time River was also tens of thousands of times stronger than before. But even so, the Time River seemed powerless under the attack of Master Tsang Muzi's magic treasure that surpassed the peak of the demi-sage level. It could only keep dodging, unable to fight back. It could only keep dodging in the void, and then try its best to block the magic treasure's attack on Luo Fan. Seeing this, Master Tsang Muzi frowned. The tree branch in his hand kept spinning, drawing mysterious trajectories in the void, and evolving all kinds of martial arts and battle principles. At this time, Luo Fan not only had to control the river of time, to resist the branch magic treasure that surpassed the peak of the safe-to-be level, but he also had to resist the attack of the ancient tree made of thunderbolts condensed by ashen musy. At this time, his figure almost did not stop for a moment in the void. At every moment, he displayed the supreme mystery of dodging. His figure flickered in the void, leaving countless shadows. This can't go on. While Luo Fan was thinking about this, there were countless thoughts constantly flashing in his mind. The mysteries of the tide of the times, the mysteries of the aura rune structure, all of them were constantly emerging and finally directly submerged his mind, making his whole mind completely immersed in the endless mysteries. With this change, his figure became more and more ethereal. In the end, he became like an ordinary willow branch, moving with the wind. No matter how the ancient tree's branches waved and attacked, they couldn't get within 3 feet of his body and hurt him. During this process, the time Chang'e's dodging and intercepting became more and more elegant and more mysterious. This made Master Tsang Yuzi's expression even more unsightly. At this moment, he completely understood what Wu Daozi had felt. Previously, he had seen Wu Daozi rush into the Qilin Cliff because of Luo Fan's attack. He had thought that Wu Daozi had underestimated Luo Fan and that Luo Fan had taken advantage of his weakness, causing him to fail miserably. In fact, he didn't care much about Luo Fan. He only thought that as long as he attacked seriously and used all his strength to deal with Luo Fan, he would definitely be able to capture Luo Fan easily. However, he didn't expect that when he attacked seriously, the person in front of him was still so slippery. He couldn't use his full strength and couldn't finish him off in a short period of time. At this moment, he realized that Wu Daozi's failure was not a fluke. The newly ascended quasi-sage before him really had the ability to compete with them. As these thoughts flashed through his mind, Master Tsang Mu made up his mind. With a thought, the ancient tree that was attacking Luo Fan trembled slightly and turned into countless bolts of lightning. The bolts of lightning shrouded an area of 10,000 kilometers, directly wrapping Luo Fan within. Although this kind of attack was a large-scale attack, covering the sky and covering the earth, as if there was nowhere to hide. However, because there were small gaps between the lightning bolts, Luo Fan easily dodged the attack with a few flashes. When the lightning completely disappeared, Luo Fan was still floating in the void, unharmed. Master Tsang Yuzi was not surprised by this. He didn't expect that such a large area attack would be able to finish off Luo Fan. The reason he turned the ancient tree into lightning was because he didn't want to use the ancient tree to attack Luo Fan. However, because he no longer wanted to use this ancient wood to attack Luo Fan, he planned to wholeheartedly control his magical weapon to subdue Luo Fan. At the last moment, he would make use of the waste, letting the thunder and lightning that made up this ancient would display its final brilliance. It would be best if Luo Fan was injured a little, but if not, he would not be surprised. Awesome. At this moment, Crazy Doe's roar came from not far away. His body was surrounded by countless lightning bolts. These bolts of lightning wrapped around his body like water droplets falling on a lotus leaf. Although they shone brightly, although they were vast and boundless, they were still unable to move. Although they were boundless, they were extremely shocking. However, they couldn't shake his body at all. They couldn't cause any changes to his body. This was the moment when Master Tsang Yuzi dispersed the ancient tree and turned it into countless lightning bolts that covered the sky. Those lightning bolts also submerged Wu Daozi and Crazy Doe. At this moment, Crazy Doe was acting like this. Even though the lightning bolts wrapped around his body, he wasn't affected at all. Wu Daozi, who was fighting against him, had an ugly expression on his face. At this time, his expression was very ugly, and he was constantly fighting Mad Fighter in the void with the bronze ruler in his hand. The lightning bolts that Master Tsang Yuzi had shot out earlier couldn't hurt him at all. The moment they got close to his body, they were naturally eliminated by the power of the bronze ruler. The bronze ruler was even able to completely block the chaos that was similar to the state of primal chaos, let alone these lightning bolts that were far inferior. Wu Daozi gritted his teeth and said, Crazy Doe, Master Tsong Musi is at a disadvantage now. Why aren't you going to help him? Are you kidding me? Master Tsong Musi is planning to use a big move now. How is he at a disadvantage? Crazy Doe laughed. As he spoke, he twisted the rod in his hand. The countless bolts of lightning around him condensed on the rod, turning into a shadow of the rod. It brought with it countless space-time shards as it shot toward Wu Daozi. Wu Daozi revealed a helpless expression. He gently turned the bronze ruler in his hand and blocked the ruler. This caused time and space to tremble violently. It was as if time and space could not withstand the shock waves of the collision and was about to collapse. At this moment, Master Tsong Musi took a deep breath. He was about to use the power of the second layer of the treasure when he suddenly noticed that the bright red river that Luo Fan had sent out suddenly trembled. It suddenly condensed in the void and turned into a normal-sized axe. This bright red river seemed to be boundlessly long, with no beginning or end. No one would think that it was wrong to say that it was millions and millions of miles long, and it wasn't wrong to say that it was only a few dozen feet long. At this moment, such a long, bright red river condensed into such an ordinary-sized axe, causing its color to suddenly increase to an inconceivable level. The entire axe looked like a bright red jade. It was so red that it was sparkling and translucent. It was so red that it would make one's heart tremble. After the axe appeared, Luo Fan suddenly appeared in front of it. He grabbed the axe with one hand and swung it toward Master Tsong Musi. This chop was like the chop Pangu used to split the heavens and earth. Wherever the axe went, time and space seemed to be afraid of it and naturally split apart to avoid it. Under this chop, all the light in the universe seemed to be attracted to it. The trajectory of the axe became extremely bright. The surrounding space, the entire world, and even the 10 suns in the sky seemed to become a lot dimmer. Even sunlight was like this, let alone the cultivators present. Almost all the cultivators, including those on the Qilin Cliff who couldn't see the battle between Luo Fan and the others, couldn't help but cast their gazes towards the position of the axe. Although they couldn't see the true appearance of the axe and couldn't see the trajectory of the axe, they felt an unprecedented feeling of being close to the great Tao enveloping them. They couldn't help but want to see the trajectory of the axe clearly. They couldn't help but want to know who was the one who made this attack and what kind of mysteries this attack contained. Good. An incomparably excited shout filled with an endless will to fight pierced through time and space to reach the ears of all the cultivators present. This voice was naturally Madman Do's voice. At this moment, Madman Do had already stopped attacking Wu Daozi. Instead, he focused all his attention and perception on Luo Fan. More specifically, he focused on the axe that Luo Fan had unleashed. The power of this chop that seemed to split the heavens and earth was unimaginably powerful. In Luo Fan's senses, this chop had even split open the gap between the heavens and the earth, directly striking into the gap between the state of chaos and the world. He could even faintly sense that after the axe slashed through space and time, there was a mysterious existence that transcended time and space and was close to the state of chaos. So this can also allow one to transcend heaven and earth. Luo Fan's mind was filled with an indescribable satisfaction. The target of his axe was Master Tsong Musi. Chapter 1034. At this moment, Master Tsong Musi's eyes narrowed and the branch in his hand shook slightly. In an instant, a ray of light surged up and completely blocked the void in front of him. Bright red, jade-like axe in Luo Fan's hand directly struck the colorful light. An indescribable power was generated from the colorful light. Everything around it, including time and space, seemed to be completely engulfed by the colorful light. The power contained in Luo Fan's axe went straight into the gap between the heaven and earth and the state of primal chaos. Its power was naturally powerful enough to destroy the heaven and earth. However, facing the engulfing power of the colorful light, facing the sweep of the colorful light, there was a feeling of chopping into a swamp. That kind of powerlessness, that kind of feeling of being unable to come out, made Luo Fan frown. However, He only frowned, and the axe in his hand shook slightly. Countless grayish existences appeared on the blade of the axe. It was as if the axe had connected a place filled with grayish existences to the world in front of the axe, causing them to surge out of that place and enter the world. The power of the colorful light was earth-shattering. However, at this moment, Master Tsang Muzi felt a strange feeling that he had never felt before. The colorful light, which would not have increased in weight even if a mountain or a continent were to be completely engulfed, suddenly became extremely heavy. Even though he was at the peak of the sage-to-be realm, he still felt that he could not bear this degree of weight. He had to hold the branch with both hands. He used all the strength in his body to lift it up. In the end, he was barely able to hold the branch and the colorful light, so that the branch and the colorful light did not fall out of his control due to the increase in strength. At this moment, he felt as if the whole world was pressing down on the branch in his hand. He was trying his best to hold up the whole world. When this feeling appeared, the light in Master Tsang Muzi's eyes froze. The power in his body surged. Raising his eyes to look at Luo Fan, his expression had already become one of shock. He had never heard of such a method before, nor had he experienced it before. The thing in his hand, it seemed to be formed by the condensation of power. It was not even a real thing. It was not even a magic treasure, but it could display such a terrifying magic power and resist the power of the second layer of the magic treasure that surpassed the peak of the sage-to-be realm. It seemed that it had the upper hand. How could he not be shocked? Luo Fan also frowned slightly at this time. Although he was happy that his era's great axe was able to block the rainbow light, he felt a headache. With the cover of the colorful light, Master Tsang Muzi was almost invincible. It was almost impossible for him to break through the colorful light and hurt Master Tsang Muzi. For Luo Fan, who wanted to defeat Master Tsang Muzi and Wu Dao Zi, and let them know that he was not to be trifled with, this was something that he could not accept. With this thought in mind, he shook his hands, and the axe in his hand turned slightly. He suddenly slashed at the colorful light, and his body turned. In the blink of an eye, he had already circled around Master Tsang Muzi several times. The axe directly left several circles of gray axe marks on the colorful light. When Master Tsang Muzi sensed Luo Fan's movement, he naturally controlled the colorful light to change into a sphere. He wrapped his body in it and completely blocked the attack of the axe. As a result, the marks of the axe attached to the colorful light made it seem as if the spherical colorful light had been corroded by something, causing the originally mysterious and natural colorful light to become full of holes, as if it was in ruins. "Condense!" Luo Fan shouted. In an instant, the grayish traces left on the colorful light seemed to have come alive. They broke off everywhere, forming countless small and short grayish lines. Then, they condensed in an extremely complicated and mysterious way and linked together on the colorful light. In the blink of an eye, it actually formed a three-dimensional talisman. This 3D talisman was completely in the shape of the colorful light, which was the spherical shape that wrapped around Master Tsang Muzi. This spherical 3D talisman was extremely complicated, and the number of lines within it was unimaginable. The appearance of the 3D talisman that was outlined by these countless lines would cause an ordinary person to feel dizzy from just looking at it, and it was even to the extent that one's head would explode from being unable to endure the complexity. After such a three-dimensional talisman was formed, it began to give birth to endless power. In an instant, it drew in the endless grayish existence in the gap between the heaven and the earth and the chaotic state. It began to spread out from inside of the three-dimensional talisman like the Milky Way, filling up the interior of the three-dimensional talisman crazily. The 3D talisman was clearly wrapped around Master Tsang Muzi and the colorful light he emitted. At this moment, when the gray existence was about to fill the 3D talisman, it was naturally equivalent to the gray existence wanting to completely drown Master Tsang Muzi and the colorful light emitted by the branch. This gray existence was the boundary between the normal world and the chaotic state. It was a wondrous existence with both the normal world and the chaotic state. This existence contained traces of the chaotic state. If one could not comprehend some of the mysteries of the chaotic state, they would not be able to resist this existence. Although Master Ashenmusi was at the peak of the sage-to-be and was much stronger than Luo Fan in terms of cultivation, he cultivated the orthodox way of cultivation. It was a cultivation method that was limited to this world. He had not even sorted out his own worldview, so it was impossible for him to sense such a wonderful existence. He could not even sense the primal chaos state, so how could he understand some of the mysteries of the primal chaos state? Even if he could deduce some of the mysteries of chaos through other methods, such as using a method to deduce some of the mysteries of chaos, compared to directly comprehending the mysteries of chaos, there would definitely be countless omissions, and it would be impossible to perfect it. As a result, to him, the gray existence in the gap between the primal chaos and heaven and earth was fatal to a peak quasi-saint like Songmuzi. It was impossible for him to resist it. If he was surrounded by these existences without any defense, he could only rely on the various preparations he had made in the past and abandon everything to escape. Fortunately, at this moment, Master Songmuzi was not surrounded by the gray existence without any defense. Around his body, there was still the colorful light protecting him. These colorful lights, they were emitted by the branch that looked like a shoulder pole. This was the second power of the branch. The branch itself was a magic treasure that surpassed the pinnacle of the sage-to-be level. One could imagine how powerful the second power of such a magic treasure was. Master Songmuzi did not have any concept of the gray existence. He did not comprehend anything. However, the existence of the colorful light, it was still enough to resist the invasion of the gray existence. It allowed him to exist in the three-dimensional seal unharmed. However, that was all it could do. If he had some understanding of this hazy gray existence, and had some understanding of its profundities, he wouldn't have been able to do so. With the power of the magic treasure that far surpassed his cultivation realm, he could easily disintegrate the three-dimensional seal and the gray existence's threat to him. However, he did not. Although the power of the colorful light was limitless, facing the three-dimensional talisman was like an adult facing a lock of Luban. All the conditions of this adult were enough to allow him to unlock the lock of Luban, but if he did not know the trick, he would not be able to unlock it no matter what. Master Songmuzi was facing such an awkward situation. He floated in the colorful light with the branch that looked like a shoulder pole in his hand. Around the colorful light was a patch of gray. Although the dusky existence appeared to be a thin layer on the outside, it was completely attached to the colorful light. However, from Ashenmusi's point of view, this gray existence was boundless. His entire body, along with the rainbow light, seemed to have sunk into a gray world. No matter where he went, no matter how many millions of miles he traveled, he could not escape the gray existence. What is this existence? Why can't I even touch the brilliant tree? Master Songmusi's mind was filled with doubt and shock. The magic treasure in his hand was called the brilliant tree. It was a magic treasure given to him by a sage. It contained the mysteries of the way of the sage. Just the mysteries within it were enough for him to comprehend for countless years. If he could fully comprehend the mysteries contained within it one day, he would naturally be able to become a sage. At this moment, although he had only comprehended the second mysteries of the brilliant tree and unleashed its second power, this power was enough to make him invincible among those below the sage level. Of course, his opponent had to not have a magic treasure of the same level, nor did they have the same level of power and talent. But even so, this kind of power that could annihilate everything had no effect on the grayish existence around him. No matter how he tried to activate the power of the lustrous, wondrous tree, he couldn't destroy it and let himself escape. How could he not be shocked? How could he not be puzzled? These existences are both chaotic and orderly. It's like the chaos that Master has described, but it's also like a normal world. Time, space, matter, and energy are all in chaos, but they also seem to follow some complicated pattern. Just what is this? Thoughts flashed through Ashenmusi's mind as he tried to figure out what this existence was. However, how could it be that simple? Although he was a peak quasi-saint and a disciple of a sage, this kind of gray existence was a completely new domain for him. The various principles that he had learned in the past had instead become obstacles for him at this moment. They would pop up from the depths of his memory from time to time, making it extremely difficult for him to comprehend and study this gray existence. It was difficult for him to gain anything. Based on his current speed, it would take him at least 100 billion years to truly understand the mysteries within and understand the true reason behind the existence of this hazy gray mist. Obviously, Luo Fan would not give him that much time. Even a world would not give him that much time. After 6 billion years, the world would shatter. As long as he did not escape by then, one could imagine the fate that awaited him. Master Tsang Muzi studied it for a while and understood this point. His expression could not help but change greatly. Then, he smiled bitterly. I didn't expect that I would be defeated by a peak quasi-saint who had just become a peak quasi-saint. This person's magical power is omnipotent. Thinking of this, he shrank the colorful light and stopped trying to destroy the gray existence around him. He also stopped trying to comprehend the mysteries of the gray existence. He only shrank it to protect himself. It was obvious that he had completely admitted defeat. The three-dimensional talisman that Luo Fan had condensed was drawn out by the axe. This was the gray existence that existed in the gap between the world and the state of chaos. This existence was completely different from his own power. It was even more chaotic. Its power was even more terrifying. If he did not have the great axe of time that was condensed from the river of time, he would not have been able to trigger that existence, let alone condense it into a three-dimensional talisman. However, when he condensed these existences into a three-dimensional talisman, he could naturally comprehend the various things inside the three-dimensional talisman through this three-dimensional talisman. He could even see through the gray existence. Through the colorful light, he could see Master Tsang Muzi's performance. When Master Tsang Muzi completely shrank the colorful light and did not move, Luo Fan instantly realized this. He immediately heaved a sigh of relief. He completely understood that Master Tsang Muzi's performance meant that he had completely admitted defeat. However, for him, this was only a benefit in name. With the protection of the colorful light, even if Master Tsang Muzi admitted defeat and did not resist, he could not do anything to him. It was impossible to break through the protection of the colorful light and hurt Master Tsang Muzi. If it was truly a battle of life and death, and no one else would intervene in the battle, he would naturally be able to directly throw it into the gap between heaven and earth and primal chaos, allowing the boundless gray existence to corrode it, thus delaying him for hundreds of millions of years. But at this moment, he could not do that. At this moment, he was on the Chilin Cliff, and there were 7 great sages in this world. Although the 7 great sages had never appeared and never showed their existence to Luo Fan did not dare to think that they really did not care about anything in this world. Those sages were high and mighty and controlled everything. If they wanted to kill the current Luo Fan, they did not even need to make a move. Just a glance was enough to destroy Luo Fan's body and soul. It was even possible that countless traces of the existence of time and space would be completely erased. In the past millions of years, those sages did not care about Luo Fan at all. No matter what the reason was, it did not mean that they would never care about what Luo Fan did. If Luo Fan went too far, such as directly suppressing Master Tsang Muzi in the gap between the world and the state of chaos, which aroused a trace of dissatisfaction in a certain sage and made that sage want to harm him on a whim, the result that awaited him was probably the most tragic one. Regardless of whether this possibility was high or not, Luo Fan would not take this risk if it was not necessary. Therefore, after knowing that Master Tsang Muzi had admitted defeat and no longer resisted, Luo Fan showed a relaxed expression and turned to look at Wu Dao Zi and Madman Do not far away. Madman Do looked at Luo Fan with a dangerous light in his eyes and said, "Looks like you were right. Master Tsang Muzi really lost." Hearing this, Luo Fan suddenly had a bad premonition. Wu Dao Zi's eyes brightened and said, Then what are you waiting for? Madman Do nodded and said, I really cannot wait any longer. If I wait any longer, the battle will be over. After saying that, he gave a light shout and slightly shook the long stick in his hand. His figure crossed the void in an instant, and the long stick in his hand somehow arrived in front of Luo Fan, smashing towards Luo Fan's head and face. Now Luo Fan finally understood what Wu Dao Zi and Master Tsang Yuzi felt. An indescribable annoyance suddenly appeared in his mind. He couldn't help but curse. This person is really crazy. However, since the staff was already in front of him, he naturally couldn't let it hit him. The bright red, great axe of the era in his hand suddenly turned and drew a mysterious trajectory in the void. Although it didn't have the momentum that seemed to be able to split heaven and earth apart, it still had a certain charm. Time and space seemed to have naturally dodged it and automatically separated in front of the axe blade, making it seem as if the axe didn't need to go through time and space. It directly appeared in front of the axe and directly collided with the long staff that was wrapped in a layer of space-time fragment film. At the moment of the collision, there was a soft pop sound. A grayish existence appeared from where the two collided and turned into a ripple that spread in all directions. It directly passed through the bodies of Luo Fan and Madman Do. It also passed through the body of Wu Dao Zi, who was about to attack Luo Fan. This grayish existence didn't affect Luo Fan at all. For him, it was like a spring breeze. However, for Madman Do and Master Tsang Yuzi, it was not the case. In that instant, both of their expressions stiffened. Their bodies seemed to have been bombarded by a huge force, and they were pushed back by the ripples. They retreated several kilometers away and only stopped when the ripples dissipated. In an instant, the two of them exclaimed at the same time, "What is this existence?" Among them, the one with the worst expression was Master Tsang Yuzi. Chapter 1035. The great axe of the ages in Luo Fan's hand collided with the long staff in Do Kuangzi's hand. The grayish existence that was triggered by the collision was not ordinary. It was the kind of grayish existence that was formed when the world was shattered. Instead, it was a kind of existence that was formed when the world and the state of chaos permeated and influenced each other. This kind of strange existence was not something that Wu Daozi and the others had ever experienced. If they used their own strength correctly, they would naturally be able to completely resist it. However, they could not use it correctly at all. Naturally, they were extremely fragile in front of this existence and could not resist it at all. Great! After Do Kuangzi exclaimed, he shouted even more excitedly. For him, fighting was the main rhythm of life. His cultivation was fighting, and fighting was his life. Being able to have a wonderful and intense battle was a wonderful thing for him. The stronger Luo Fan was, the more he could enjoy the fun of fighting. Naturally, the better it was. After he shouted, the long staff that had been broken turned again, leaving an afterimage in the void. It directly blasted towards Luo Fan's chest. In the collision just now, the grayish existence caused by the great axe of the ages did not have much effect on him. However, the power contained in Do Kuangzi's long staff caused him a lot of damage, causing his body to stiffen in the void for a while. He even faintly felt that his internal organs, his strength, his spirit, and his will were all damaged by the bombardment of this staff. Fortunately, Do Kuangzi had retreated for a while before recovering to attack him. He had to seize the time to recover. By this time, he had completely recovered, and his fighting strength had not been weakened in the slightest. In the face of such a long stick, the axe in Luo Fan's hand trembled and swayed in the void, and all kinds of martial arts mysteries were displayed between his axe. One after another, mysterious trajectories, and one after another, mysterious axe shadows constantly collided with the long stick in Mad Fighter's hand. The trajectory of the axe in Luo Fan's hand contained the mysteries of martial arts that were enough to set off a bloody storm in the cultivation world. The fighting method that Do Kuangzi displayed when he waved his long staff was also no less than the martial arts principles displayed by the bright red axe in Luo Fan's hand. It was also enough to set off a bloody storm in the cultivation world. The battle between the two was really evenly matched. They were locked in a stalemate. The sky and the earth turned upside down, and the sun and moon lost their light. Wave after wave of grayish existence spread in all directions as the axe and the long staff collided, creating circles of ripples. Wu Daozi, who wanted to find an opportunity to join the attack, could only use the bronze ruler in his hand to constantly resist these grayish existence. He could not find an opportunity to join the battle, let alone subduing Luo Fan. He stood on the side, watching the battle between Luo Fan and Do Guangzi. The bronze ruler in his hand trembled slightly. Every time he wanted to join the battle, there would either be a grayish existence rushing towards him, forcing him to resist, or he would find that Do Guangzi had already attacked. The opportunity he saw before had completely disappeared, so he could only find another opportunity to join the battle. Wu Daozi floated in the void. Below him was the almost endless Qilin Cliff. Although the aftermath of their battle caused the space and time to change, making it impossible for the people below to see the scene of their battle clearly, this kind of grievance still made him feel very annoyed. The anger in his heart was constantly accumulating. As time passed, the battle between Luo Fan and Do Guangzi became more and more intense. As the battle continued, the grayish existence that Luo Fan had triggered had less and less effect on Do Guangzi. This was not because Do Guangzi understood the mysteries of this grayish existence more and more. Instead, it was because Do Guangzi's outstanding battle instincts allowed him to gradually adapt to the method that Luo Fan used to trigger this grayish existence. This allowed him to resist the influence of this existence, according to Luo Fan's method of triggering it. It was just like a martial artist, facing an endless rain of arrows. If he was fast enough, observant enough, and had a good grasp of timing, he could leisurely stroll through the endless rain of arrows. This way, the rain of arrows could not pose a threat to him. However, this did not mean that the rain of arrows would not affect the warrior. This was the case for Do Guangzi at this moment. If he were to directly come into contact with this gray, hazy existence, there would still be some consequences. At the very least, he would be blasted back. However, he was able to use various methods to avoid these gray, hazy existences and easily avoid being affected by these gray, hazy existences. Do Guangzi's battle instincts allowed him to do this. Naturally, Luo Fan, who had outstanding attainments in martial arts, would not be without any gains. Through this period of fighting with Do Guangzi, Luo Fan gradually became familiar with the form of Do Guangzi's power. After the collision, he was no longer in a state of shock and stiffness like at the beginning. Instead, he was able to easily divert these forces so that his body would not be affected in the slightest. For Do Guangzi, this kind of stalemate was naturally an extremely satisfying battle. It allowed him to fight for 100 years while laughing and shouting excitedly. However, for Luo Fan, this kind of battle was not a bad thing. At least, it allowed him to better understand what kind of divine sense and power a peak sage-to-be had, as well as the specific differences between a peak sage-to-be and a Dao master. Therefore, during this battle, the two of them became more and more happy and immersed in it. Eventually, they even gradually forgot about Qilin Cliff, Wu Daozi, and Ashimuzi. Wu Daozi waited on the side for dozens of days. Finally, when he found that the battle between Luo Fan and Do Guangzi seemed to be able to continue indefinitely, he finally could not bear it any longer. He snorted coldly and shook the bronze ruler in his hand. Suddenly, a huge shadow flashed across the bronze ruler. This shadow was a huge human figure that filled the world. It held a ruler in its hand as if it was measuring the Great Way. The face of this figure was blurry, and there seemed to be countless shadows of strange beasts flashing around it. After it appeared, the void within a radius of millions of miles seemed to be shrouded in a strange atmosphere. It seemed that the heaven and earth in this area had been included in some strange rules. All kinds of inexplicable changes were happening with the ruler in the hand of the shadow. After the shadow was formed, Wu Daozi waved the bronze ruler in his hand and pointed at the gray existence that was surrounding them in a ring. It even shattered the surrounding space and used a terrifying power to forcibly suppress the battle. To be more specific, it pointed at Luo Fan, who was fighting fiercely with Do Quanzi. He seemed to be a little excited and happy. Following this point, the huge shadow that came out of the bronze ruler gently turned the ruler in its hand and compared it to Luo Fan, as if it was measuring something. Amidst this change, Luo Fan suddenly felt his whole body shake. It was as if the Great Way had suddenly wrapped around him and produced countless arms to grab him. It was as if it wanted to fix him in the void and start a play with him. An indescribable sense of danger shrouded him. He instantly understood that if he did not do something, what awaited him would be. His body and soul would be destroyed. Not good. A thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. He had already noticed the change in Wu Daozi. He knew that this was the mysterious power of the bronze ruler. His eyes flashed with seriousness. At this moment, he was chopping down on Do Quanzi's head. Seeing this, the bright red great axe of the era in his hand turned slightly. The mysterious trajectory of the axe turned a subtle arc in the void and directly chopped into the void. It split open the gap between heaven and earth and the state of chaos. As the gap was split open, an endless amount of grayish existences gushed out from it, covering the sky and covering the earth. It enveloped a radius of 10,000 li around his body. This range not only included Luo Fan, but also Wu Daozi, the gray three-dimensional seal that Ashenwood Master was in, and Do Quanzi. When this gray existence wrapped around his body, Luo Fan felt his body relax. It was the feeling of being locked on by the Great Way. The feeling of being manipulated by the Great Way completely disappeared. What replaced it was an indescribable sense of ease. Good move. However, if you want to escape like this, you are delusional. Wu Daozi sneered, and the bronze ruler in his hand suddenly slashed. Just as the gray existence was about to drown him, the huge human figure that appeared on the bronze ruler turned slightly. The ruler in its hand shook slightly, and the surrounding gray existence scattered in all directions at a speed visible to the naked eye. It formed a larger and larger space around Wu Daozi. This space was not the same as the space in the outside world. This space that was expanding in all directions had countless squares and seemed to have countless scales. Even time and space seemed to have become some kind of scale. One could even faintly see countless clocks in this space. After this space appeared, it continued to spread forward. In the blink of an eye, it had already enveloped Luo Fan in this space. In an instant, countless scales appeared on Luo Fan's body. One could even faintly see countless geometric patterns appearing on his body. It looked like the real world had suddenly become a three-dimensional coordinate model in a computer. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly felt that there was a lot of information on his body that was spreading in all directions. All of his body's secrets seemed to be starting to leave his body. They were becoming clearer and more obvious to the world. Good. Now Wu Daozi has the upper hand again. At this moment, an excited roar entered Luo Fan's ears. Hearing this, Luo Fan immediately knew what was going on. It was Wu Daozi seeing that he was in such a situation and thought that he was at a disadvantage. It seemed like he wanted to help Luo Fan. However, no matter what he did, Luo Fan could not do anything to stop all of his body's secrets from spreading. He could not allow himself to be controlled by Wu Daozi. He suddenly spun the axe in his hand, and the axe instantly chopped out millions of times around his body. These millions of axes' trajectories were blurry. They directly outlined a complex and mysterious three-dimensional seal. It directly wrapped his entire body in it. After the three-dimensional seal appeared, the space inside and outside the three-dimensional seal was completely separated. The strange space outside could no longer invade the three-dimensional seal. Naturally, it could not corrode Luo Fan's body. This caused the information that was constantly leaking out of Luo Fan's body to stop. The feeling that his body's secrets were unreservedly revealed completely disappeared without a trace. This was obviously also temporary. Although the three-dimensional talisman was composed of a grayish existence, the power of the rectangular space-time displayed by the bronze ruler was too powerful. Although the three-dimensional seal was formed, it was still under extremely terrifying pressure. Crackling sounds could be heard from the three-dimensional talisman, as if it could collapse and be destroyed at any time. Facing such a situation, how could Luo Fan dare to relax? The axe in his hand kept moving. More and more blurry existences were triggered by his axe from the gap between heaven and earth and the state of chaos. They formed three-dimensional seal after three-dimensional seal. Layer after layer of 3D talisman was formed inside the 3D talisman, combining with the 3D talisman that was formed at the beginning in an extremely subtle and mysterious way, making the 3D talisman that was protecting him seem to have more and more layers. Because of this change, the three-dimensional seal's shaky feeling of being destroyed at any time became smaller and smaller. The crackling sounds also became shorter and shorter. Finally, when the layers of the three-dimensional talisman reached 990,000, the clicking sound finally disappeared completely. The three-dimensional seal had finally completely stabilized. It had completely withstood the pressure of the surrounding rule space. At this moment, Luo Fan was in the mood to look outside. This time, he could not help but smile bitterly. It turned out that at this time, outside the three-dimensional seal, Crazy Doe and Wu Daozi were fighting again. Wu Daozi waved the bronze ruler in his hand, and the huge human figure in the air waved the ruler with one hand. The other hand displayed all kinds of unfathomable and profound hand seals. Profound martial arts were constantly attacking Mad Dozi. As for the rule space, at this time, it had stopped spreading. It just wrapped around the area where Luo Fan and Crazy Doe were. At this time, Crazy Doe's body was wrapped in an extremely strange blood-red light. This blood-red light was only a thin layer, tightly wrapped around his body and the long rod. What was revealed on it was an indescribable battle intent, containing a shocking iron-blooded aura. This battle intent, this aura, completely isolated the surrounding rule space from the erosion of Crazy Doe. This allowed Crazy Doe to move in the rule space effortlessly as if he was in a normal space-time. At this time, the long rod in his hand was constantly waving in the void. Every time he waved it, there would be a blood-red light that left the long rod. It flashed through the air in mysterious trajectories and attacked Wu Dao Zi's shadow that surged out of the bronze ruler, attacking Wu Dao Zi's body. The form of the blood-red light was like a long rod. They looked like long rods with astonishing power. Even the rectangular space-time couldn't resist the changes. The squares and scales that existed in the space-time were distorted and assimilated by the blood-red light. Every time the blood-red light passed through, a portion of the space-time would return to normal, forcing the humanoid figure to swing the rectangular ruler in his hand to repair the damage to the rectangular space-time. The blood-red light of the long rod was like that to the rule space, but it didn't cause much damage to the humanoid phantom and Wu Daozi. The empty arm of the humanoid phantom swayed, displaying all kinds of hand seals. The martial arts were subtle and profound. Although it wasn't extremely easy, it wasn't very difficult either. The countless blood-red rod phantoms that were waved by the long rod were completely destroyed. The long rod phantoms couldn't hurt the phantom at all, let alone Wu Daozi. Crazy Doe, what the hell are you doing? You'll deal with whoever wins. If this goes on, when will this battle end? Wu Daozi was so depressed at this time that he roared. He had managed to restrain Luo Fan within the three-dimensional seal charm with great difficulty, and now was the time to harvest the fruits of victory. But how could Madman Doe actually interfere, making him unable to spare any energy to deal with Luo Fan? One could imagine how depressing such a thing was for him. Why do I have to fight? I want to fight until the end of time, until the world is destroyed. Ha! Crazy Doe laughed loudly. His excitement, his determination, and his fighting spirit could be clearly sensed by ordinary people, let alone an existence like Wu Daozi. Hearing Crazy Doe's words, The irritation in Wu Daozi's eyes became even more intense. He wasn't a fighting maniac, fighting until the end of time, until the world was destroyed. This was simply the cruelest torture for him. How could he be willing? How could he be willing? You lunatic! He roared and waved the bronze ruler in his hand rapidly. The humanoid phantom that surged out of the bronze ruler moved even faster and more powerful. Good. Crazy Doe felt the increasing pressure, but he still roared. Instead, his fighting spirit rose even more, and his voice became even more excited. Correspondingly, the movements of the long rod in his hand became increasingly exquisite. The blood-red light that gushed out from it became even more condensed, and its might became even more powerful. Chapter 1036. The incomparably furious Wu Dao Zi's movements became even more intense. The power of the second layer of the ruler in his hand was continuously activated by him. That power was truly earth-shattering. It caused the entire world to undergo various indescribable changes as he displayed it. At this time, Luo Fan was protected in the center by the gray layers of three-dimensional talismans, completely isolating the outside world from the influence of the matrix spacetime. His whole body floated there, closely watching the battle between Wu Dao Zi and Mad Do Zi. The battle between the two of them contained the profoundness of countless pinnacles sage to be, which made Luo Fan gain a lot from watching. He felt that his horizons were broadened as the battle progressed. After the conversation between Mad Do and Wu Dao Zi, he didn't care. After a few days of fighting with Mad Do, he knew that Mad Do was a battle maniac. Fighting was his cultivation. Fighting was his joy. Only in battle could he feel the truth. For normal cultivators, leisure and cultivation were the norm. Battles were the embellishments that they had no choice but to do. But for a battle maniac, fighting was the norm. Only leisure and cultivation were the embellishments that he had no choice but to do. With such a mentality, it was naturally better for him to fight for as long as possible. In fact, it would be best for him to fight from the beginning of the world creation until the world was destroyed and the world was destroyed. He even faintly felt that Wu Dao Zi had never tried to understand Crazy Do before. How could he not even know this? He even needed to ask Crazy Do about this. After watching for a while, Luo Fan shifted his gaze. He turned to look at Master Ashen Musi, who was wrapped in the ruler space-time and sealed in the three-dimensional talisman he had created with a gray existence. The three-dimensional talisman was still there. It was gray and extremely complicated. When it fell into the ruler space-time, it was like a little gray duckweed falling into the ocean. It was constantly fluctuating along with the square in the ruler space-time, but it was not affected by the square and the ruler space-time at all. If there are no external forces involved in this battle, I will be able to kill all of them. It should go on for a very, very long time. Right now, it was impossible for Wu Dao Zi to break away from the battle, unless he's ruthless enough to let Madman Do trample on him without resisting. Then it's a different story. When Luo Fan saw that Master Ashenwood showed no signs of breaking out of the seal, this thought flashed through his mind. With Do Kuangzi's cultivation realm, with his personality, with his strength, he joined the battle between Luo Fan, Wu Dao Zi, and Ashen Muzi. It was as if a balance had appeared between the three countries. Whichever side situation was worse, he would help that side and balance the situation. Whichever side had the upper hand, he would attack that side, similarly balancing the situation. If this went on, it was obvious that the battle would continue until an external force broke the balance. You guys fight first. I'll take a break and comprehend it first. After thinking this through, Luo Fan smiled and murmured to himself. With that said, he began to focus his attention on the ruler space-time in front of him. This ruler space-time was completely different from all the space-times he had seen in the past. The ability that the bronze ruler used to construct the ruler space-time was also different from all the abilities he had seen in the past. For Luo Fan, this was obviously an opportunity to broaden his horizons. It would allow him to comprehend the mysteries that he had never understood before, and it would allow his cultivation to improve to an extent that he could not have imagined in the past. Just as Luo Fan's clone joined the seemingly endless battle in this universe that had yet to shatter and become the Earth in the Age of Chaos, which was billions of trillions of years away from this moment. In the gap between heaven and earth and the state of chaos, Luo Fan's body was undergoing earth-shattering changes. Because the gap between heaven and earth and the state of chaos contained the mysteries of heaven and earth itself, it contained the aura of chaos, and its nature became extremely mysterious. It could transcend time and space, allowing the practitioners who could see through this gap to have a perception that transcended time, break through the limitations of the era, and perceive all kinds of things that happened billions of years ago. Before this, Luo Fan had been using this characteristic to connect with his clone. He had seen all the experiences of his clone, and he was aware of all the senses and changes of his clone. Whether it was when he was cultivating inside the talisman, when he clashed with Wu Daozi, when he saw the battle between Wu Daozi and Master Ashenwood, or even when he obtained the aura from the Tao Comprehension praying mat and sank into the endless space of runes, it was as if he had personally experienced it. Not a single thing was left out. Similarly, the various gains of his doppelgangers were also his own gains. When his clone broke through the realm shackles and broke through the end of the transcendent realm to peacefully step into the Tao Master realm, Luo Fan's body, which was billions of years later, also made a breakthrough. At the same time, his cultivation realm broke through the realm shackles, and he also instantly stepped into the Tao Master realm, becoming a supreme Tao Master. At this time, he sat cross-legged on the three-dimensional talisman outside the Law realm, and his body began to emit a mysterious aura. This aura contained endless mysteries and endless power. The moment it appeared, the grayish existence in the gap between heaven and earth and the state of chaos began to churn endlessly. Vaguely, the dusky existences in the surroundings of this world seemed to be being pushed away. I didn't expect that in the end, I would still be able to obtain such great benefits by relying on this doppelganger and break through the strongest shackles of the realm before becoming a saint. Such a thought flashed in Luo Fan's mind. Then, his entire mind was completely drowned by the mysterious feeling brought about by the Tao Master Realm. Endless supreme mysteries, the principles of the universe, and the mysteries of chaos were born out of thin air in that instant, drowning his entire mind and consciousness, making him feel as if he had been plunged into an endless sea of mysteries in that instant. What he saw, what he felt, what he heard, what his body touched, what his mouth tasted, and what his nose smelled were all mysteries that he had pondered over in the past but failed to obtain. In that instant, his view of the world was greatly perfected. Looking up, the range of the state of chaos that he could sense had also greatly increased. Among them, the mysteries that he could comprehend from the state of chaos. It had also greatly increased, and his body, his strength, his will, and his perception, his divine soul, everything about him. At the same time, there was a shocking change, and all of them instantly improved by many times. In the blink of an eye, he felt that he could easily crush his previous self. However, even so, he didn't feel that he had become very powerful. This wasn't contradictory to his strength. He didn't feel that he had become very powerful, which meant that his improvement was completely under his absolute control. He still had perfect control over his own strength and everything about himself, just like in the past. Naturally, he would not feel powerful when he could perfectly control his strength. This was like an ordinary person who grew up from a child to an adult. His feeling of his own strength was actually the same. If there was no other strength to compare, there was absolutely no difference between an adult and a child in terms of their own strength. So, this is the Tao Master. Luo Fan let out a long sigh. At this time, when he looked at the Great Way again, he naturally had a feeling of looking down. Although the Great Way was grand and vast, he still seemed so small compared to it. However, he had a feeling that the Great Way could no longer affect him, and any changes in the Great Way could no longer affect him. He had already become an existence that was even more noble than the Great Way. This feeling is just too wonderful. Luo Fan murmured with an extremely satisfied smile on his face. A kind of great perfection, great freedom, and great freedom filled his mind and mind. At this moment, Luo Fan was standing on the three-dimensional seal around the lower realm. He slightly opened his arms and closed his eyes. There was a satisfied smile on his face, as if he was enjoying an incomparably wonderful feeling. Tens of thousands of years had passed since he started paying attention to the clone that had existed billions of years ago. After all, it was time that separated the main body from the clone, not space. Therefore, the time that the two experienced was naturally not synchronized. It could even be said that if Luo Fan was willing, he could even directly pay attention to the various encounters of the doppelganger at any point in time. After all, for the main body, everything that the doppelganger had encountered had already happened. As long as there was a connection between the doppelganger and the main body, there was no difference at all. However, that was not necessary. After all, since it had already happened, what was the point of wasting some time to comprehend every bit of the clone's experience? Anyway, it would not affect anything. So it was better to follow the clone to comprehend the various senses and changes. As for understanding the clone's experience in the future and then passing on to the clone in the past, it was even more unnecessary. If telling the clone's future experience in the past could change the future, it would mean that the future was not the real future. It would be meaningless to tell him, and he would still experience a completely unfamiliar future. If he could not change the future, wouldn't telling him only add to his worries? What would be the point? It was precisely because of this unsynchronized time that Luo Fan's doppelganger had already experienced millions of years, but Luo Fan's main body had only experienced tens of thousands of years. This was obviously because Luo Fan did not have too much patience to waste time comprehending the complicated chores of his doppelganger, and directly skipped a lot of the time wasted on these chores. Luo Fan stood on the three-dimensional talisman, carefully savoring the wonderful feeling of being a Tao master. After a long time, he slowly recovered from the wonderful feeling. Looking down at the huge three-dimensional talisman under his feet, he could not help but frown. This three-dimensional talisman had 12,960 layers, and in the past, it was already profound and profound. It contained boundless truths and possessed boundless might. However, after he became a Tao master and understood many mysteries of the aura and rune structure, this three-dimensional talisman seemed so crude. It was almost to the point that he could not bear to look at it. It's a complete waste of its real power. Luo Fan looked at the three-dimensional talisman, shook his head, and sighed. A thought flashed through his mind, and he took a step forward. He had already arrived outside the three-dimensional talisman and was directly suspended in the middle of the boundless gray existence. In the past, this grayish existence could still have a great impact on him, and he needed to borrow the power of the three-dimensional talisman to completely isolate this influence. But at this moment, this boundless gray existence was like an ordinary gray fog to him. It could not affect him at all. He floated there. No matter how the grayish existences encircled him, it was as if those grayish existences did not exist. He appeared to be so calm and composed. Standing here, Luo Fan raised his hand towards the huge three-dimensional talisman. He pointed at the 12,960 layers of the three-dimensional talisman. In an instant, the three-dimensional talisman shook, and endless strange brilliance rushed out from the three-dimensional talisman. These lights were the changes that occurred when the gray existence hit the three-dimensional talisman. It had always existed. The reason why it hadn't appeared before was only because Luo Fan had borrowed the magical effect of the three-dimensional talisman to completely absorb the light and pour it into the law realm. After it appeared at this time, the 12,960 layers of three-dimensional talisman, like a star, seemed to become a sun that illuminated all things. Even the boundless gray existence could not cover it, and it spread very far. Seeing this, Luo Fan's right hand, which was pointing at the three-dimensional talisman, shook slightly. In an instant, the three-dimensional talisman completely collapsed, and the layers of three-dimensional talisman directly turned into countless silk threads. With a turn, they formed countless three-dimensional talisman, forming a cloud of mist, which still maintained the previous star-sized sphere shape. When this change occurred, the endless brilliance that was emitted from the sphere disappeared in an instant. If it were not for the protection of Luo Fan's power, the three-dimensional talisman would have been completely washed away and engulfed by the gray existence in the surroundings. The sphere formed by the three-dimensional talisman could have such incredible power that it could withstand the impact of the gray existence, and even turn the impact force into endless light. This was not because the three-dimensional talisman was made of high-grade materials, but because of the mysterious structure of the three-dimensional talisman. Without this structure, the three-dimensional talisman itself would be completely engulfed, assimilated, and eventually disappeared without a trace when it fell into the gap between heaven and earth and chaos. How could he have any ability to resist? At this moment, the three-dimensional talisman had completely dispersed from its original structure. Having lost its structure, it naturally could not resist the erosion and assimilation of the gray existence. I must complete this within 10 breaths, or the law realm will suffer irreparable damage. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. The original purpose of the three-dimensional talisman sphere was to protect the law realm from being eroded and assimilated by the gray existence in the gap. At this moment, the overall structure of the three-dimensional talisman collapsed, and the law realm lost its protection. Luo Fan could only rely on his own power to protect the entire law realm from being eroded. However, even though Luo Fan was now a Dao master, and the power of his divine sense was even more terrifying than that of a peak sage to be, there was still a limit to it. It was naturally not a problem for him to protect himself, and he did not even need to use any means. He could naturally make his body not be affected by the gray existence in the surroundings. However, it was still a little too much for him to protect such a large law realm, and even more so to protect the enormous three-dimensional talisman that was the size of a star. 10 breaths of time was the limit of what he could do. If more than 10 breaths of time passed, his power would no longer be able to perfectly protect all of this. No matter how unwilling he was, he could only allow the law realm to be corroded by the dusky existence. Eventually, it would be completely destroyed and assimilated into the dusky existence around it. Everything within the law realm, including all living beings, all matter, and all power, would not be able to escape. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan did not look anxious at all. His expression and actions were still calm. He gently waved his hands, and in accordance with his thoughts and his will, he began to control the endless three-dimensional talisman. Under his control, the countless three-dimensional talisman began to reassemble according to an extremely complicated and abstruse pattern. These three-dimensional talisman directly formed 99 spherical talisman layers, which looked like 99 round eggshells. Among them, the structure of each three-dimensional talisman layer was based on the strongest structure that he had comprehended. The 99 spherical talisman layers were equivalent to 99 of the strongest three-dimensional talisman layer structures that he had comprehended. After the 99 three-dimensional talisman layers were formed, rays of wisdom suddenly flashed in Luo Fan's mind, and countless inspirations suddenly emerged from the depths of his heart. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly saw the light, and suddenly understood the answer to the question that he had been unable to understand in the past. He could not help but laugh out loud. So that's how it is. As he laughed, he no longer hesitated and raised his hand to quickly sketch in the void. Looking at the way he sketched, it seemed like he was sketching words one after another.